Hey fam, this is Game of Theories. Today's story is gonna blow your mind. What if Jon Snow was legitimized the night before the Red Wedding? Show some love with a like and subscribe. Here we go. Chapter 1. The letter the wind off the Frostfangs had teeth that night. Jon Snow stood on the eastern ramparts of Castle Black and let it bite him. He'd stopped flinching from the cold somewhere around his second ranging beyond the wall, somewhere between the fist of the first men and the long, terrible walk back with dead men behind him and fewer living ones than he'd started with. The cold was just a fact now, like stone underfoot and the smell of oil from the torches and the distant sound of free folk settling into their camps south of the wall. You learned to stop fighting it. You learned to wear it like armor. Ghost was somewhere below. Jon could feel him the way he always could, a warm red pull at the edge of his thoughts, patient and watchful. The direwolf had been restless all day, pacing the yard in slow circles, and the men had given him a wide berth. Even Pip, who'd spent 2 years learning not to flinch at Ghost's teeth, had found reasons to be elsewhere. Jon didn't know what the wolf sensed. He had his own suspicions. He'd been uneasy since morning, a cold unease different from the cold of the air, something that lived behind his sternum and pressed. He heard the boots on the stairs before Ed's voice came up behind him. Raven, Ed said. He sounded how he always sounded, resigned, like the raven had come specifically to ruin his evening, which it probably had. From Riverrun, Maester Aemon wants you. Jon turned from the wall. Ed was holding a torch and looking at him with that particular expression he wore when he knew something was wrong, but had decided that mentioning it would only make things worse. His face in the torchlight was long and mournful, which was just his face, but Jon had learned to read the specific shade of Ed's misery by now, and this one was different. "What?" Jon said. "Just come see the Maester." Jon came down the stairs 2 at a time. Maester Aemon was 100 years old and blind, and he still somehow managed to be the most perceptive man at Castle Black. He was sitting at his writing table when Jon pushed through the door, his white-filmed eyes aimed at the candle flame as though he could feel its warmth, his fingers resting flat on a piece of parchment. The raven was still in its cage, black and bright-eyed, clicking its beak. "Jon," Aemon said, not a question. Ed said sit down. Jon sat. He had not been told to sit by Maester Aemon in a very long time. The last time was when news had come of Ned Stark's execution, and Aemon had held his hand in both of his ancient ones and told him about the weight of blood, about the cost of loving the world you lived in. Jon had been 16. He'd cried and hated himself for it. He was not 16 anymore. "The raven is from Robb," Aemon said. "Your brother." "Half-brother," Jon said. The old reflex, Aemon's expression was very still. "Write it." Jon reached for the parchment. The handwriting was Robb's. He'd know it anywhere, the way the R curved, the slight slant left that their Maester at Winterfell had spent 3 years trying to correct. It was not long, 3 sentences, really. Jon read them once and then read them again. "By right of my blood and authority as king in the north, I hereby declare Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, to be legitimized and acknowledged as Jon Stark, true-born son of Eddard Stark, of the house and blood of Stark. He is named my heir should I die without issue. I send this record to Castle Black, to the Citadel, and to the lords of the North as witness. Robb Stark, king in the North, written this night at the Twins." Jon read it a 3rd time. The words didn't change. He set the paper down on the table and looked at it. The candle flame moved. The raven clicked. Outside, somewhere distant, a wolf howled, not Ghost, something wilder, something from further north, and the sound of it came through the stone walls like it was coming through water. "The Twins," Jon said. "Yes," said Aemon. "He's there for a wedding. Edmure Tully's wedding to a Frey girl." Jon's voice was very flat. He was doing something with the information, turning it over, looking at its edges. "He sent this the night before the wedding." "He did." Jon looked up at the old Maester. "Why would he do this now? Why at the Twins?" Aemon was quiet for a moment. In the silence, Jon could hear the old man's breathing, slow and careful. "I think," Aemon said, "that your brother went to that wedding knowing something might go wrong." The cold that moved through Jon then had nothing to do with the wind. He stood up. Didn't know he was going to until he was already standing, the chair scraping back, his hand finding Longclaw's pommel without being told to. Not a threat, just a habit, something to hold when the ground moved. "Send another raven," Jon said. "Back to—" "There is no return address on this letter," Aemon said gently. "It was sent from a Frey rookery. Whatever we send back goes to the Freys." Jon stood there. "Sit down, Jon." He sat. The silence stretched. The raven in its cage ruffled its feathers and was still. "What does it mean?" Jon said at last. Not about the letter. He understood the letter. He meant something larger, and he thought Aemon probably knew that. The old man seemed to consider the question very seriously, the way he considered everything, turning it in his mind with the careful hands of a man who'd spent a century picking up sharp things. It means, Aemon said, that as of this night you are Jon Stark, heir to Winterfell. And your brother is sitting at a table inside a castle that does not belong to him, in the company of men whose loyalty he purchased with a broken promise. A broken promise. Robb had been betrothed to a Frey girl, everyone knew that. He'd married Jane Westerling instead and paid for it with apology and his uncle's dignity. Jon thought about Walder Frey and felt the chill deepen. He knows, Jon said slowly. Robb knows the Freys are angry. He goes there anyway because he needs the crossing, because he needs the men, because he stopped. He legitimized me before going inside because he wanted there to be an heir. Aemon said nothing. He didn't need to. Jon looked at the letter again. At the curve of Robb's R at the date, this night at the Twins. He's still alive right now, Jon said, not a question, a fact he needed to say out loud to make it real. Tonight he's alive. We don't know otherwise, but you think something's going to happen. Aemon folded his hands in his lap. He was very still, the way very old men are still, not peacefully, but like men who have learned the hard way not to spend energy they don't have on emotions they can't afford. I think Walder Frey is a man who remembers every slight, Aemon said, and I think your brother gave him a very large one. Jon rose from the chair again, and this time Aemon didn't tell him to sit. Us to the window. The yard below was mostly dark, a torch by the armory, a torch by the main gate, the faint glow from the cookhouse where someone was up late. Ghost had stopped pacing. The direwolf was sitting perfectly still in the center of the yard, white as new snow, facing north, and even from up here Jon could see the tension in those massive shoulders. If something happens to Robb, Jon said, the North has no king. The North has you. Jon turned from the window. I'm a man of the Night's Watch. I swore. You swore when you were a bastard with nowhere else to go, Aemon said, and there was something in his voice that cut, not cruelty, but a kind of clear-eyed precision that the very old sometimes had, the ability to say true things without flinching. You swore because it was the only door that was open to you. Jon, he paused, and the pause had weight. I loved someone once, gave them up because I thought my duty demanded it. I have spent 100 years wondering if I was right. Jon looked at him. I am not telling you to break your oath, Aemon said. I am telling you to be honest about what that oath costs. The Watch is not the North, and the North needs a Stark, Jon said. Yes, outside someone was shouting. Not an alarm, a laugh, rough and sudden, from the direction of the Free Folk camp. Normal sounds. The sounds of men who didn't know yet that anything might be wrong. Jon stood in the candlelight with his brother's letter in his hand and felt the world he'd built for himself here, the friendships, the purpose, the slow, hard-won authority he'd been carving out stone by stone, feel suddenly provisional. Like a shelter he'd been living in that he'd always known, somewhere underneath everything, wasn't permanent. He was Jon Stark now. It didn't feel like anything. It felt like a stone dropped in deep water. The ripples hadn't reached the surface yet. He didn't sleep. He sat in his quarters with Longclaw across his knees and the letter on the table in front of him, and he thought. There were things he knew and things he suspected and things he was afraid to know. Robb had gone to the Twins with his mother and his bannermen and the remnants of an army that had been winning and then losing and then surviving. He had a queen with child, at least there were rumors of that, reaching the wall the way all rumors did, diluted and delayed. He had the great Jon, or had had him before the Lannisters took him prisoner. He had Roose Bolton. Jon stopped on that name, let it sit. Roose Bolton, Lord of the Dreadfort. A man who'd fought for Robb throughout the war and had, by most accounts, performed adequately. A man whose natural expression, from what Jon remembered hearing, was the absence of any expression. A man whose house words were our blades are sharp. Jon didn't know why he stopped on Roose Bolton. Some instinct, some bristling in the back of his mind. He let it be. Instinct had kept him alive beyond the wall more than once. He was still sitting there when Pip knocked and entered without waiting for an answer, which meant it was early morning and something had changed. Pip was pale. His usual animation, the bounce and chatter that Jon had spent years finding simultaneously exhausting and comforting, was entirely absent. He was holding a second piece of parchment, and his hand was not steady. Ravens, he said, 2 more, from different directions. Jon was on his feet. He was out the door before Pip finished speaking, moving through the pre-dawn dark of Castle Black's corridors at something faster than a walk, past the sleeping quarters and the armory passage and the long cold hall that connected the main keep to Maester Aemon's tower. He could hear Pip's feet behind him hurrying to keep up. The Maester was already awake, already sitting at his table. There were 2 ravens in their cages now and 2 pieces of parchment on the table. Jon didn't sit down this time, he took them both. The first was from a northern lord. He didn't recognize which one immediately, but the seal was a flayed man, and that identified it soon enough. Lord Bolton, Roose Bolton, writing to the Night's Watch, or perhaps writing to every party he could think of, spreading news with the industriousness of a man who wanted to be first. Tragedy at the Twins. The Freys have slain our king. Robb Stark is dead. I am returning north to restore order. The second parchment was unsigned. Written in a hand Jon didn't know, rushed and slanting, ink blotted in places like the writer had been shaking. King Robb is dead. Lady Catelyn is dead. The Freys killed them at the feast. All dead. Lord Bolton rode out before the slaughter. He knew. Warn the North. Warn anyone who will listen. Jon read both letters. Read them again. He set them both down on the table very carefully, side by side. The deliberateness of the motion was a choice, something to occupy his hands so that the rest of him could hold itself together. Robb was dead. His mother was dead. He stood there and felt it, and didn't look away from it the way you always wanted to look away from something this large. His father was dead. Bran and Rickon were. He'd heard the rumors, Theon Greyjew's cruelty, the burned boys. Sansa was a prisoner in King's Landing. Arya was missing, had been missing so long that missing had started to become its own kind of permanent, and now Robb. He stood there with the letters in front of him and thought about Robb the way you thought about someone who'd just become a memory, reaching for the specific things, the real things, the weight of a person before they became grief. Robb teaching him the basic guard in the courtyard at Winterfell, more patient than Jon deserved. Robb's laugh, which was too loud, always had been too loud, the kind of laugh that filled rooms. Robb at 17 with his crown of bronze and a war he hadn't asked for, straight-backed and set-jawed, leading men twice his age because no one else was going to do it. Robb, who had signed a piece of paper the night before he died that said Jon Stark. Pip was standing in the doorway. He'd read it in Jon's face. Jon could tell. He wasn't saying anything. Pip always said something always, but he was standing there with his mouth pressed shut and his eyes glassy, and Jon was grateful for it. "Leave me," Jon said. "Jon, please." Pip left. Maester Aemon was very still at his table, his blind eyes forward. He already knew, had probably known before Jon arrived. He was not going to say anything pious or false, which Jon appreciated about him. Some griefs didn't require words. This was one of them. Jon stood in the candlelight for a long time. By the time the sun cleared the eastern peaks, a cold, gray winter sun, grudging in the way winter suns always were, Jon had made several decisions. He'd done his thinking in the night. He'd let himself grieve in the dark, in private, without witnesses. He'd allowed himself the hour or two of sitting with the crushing weight of it, the way it landed on your chest and made everything feel slightly tilted, slightly wrong, the world rearranging itself into a shape you hadn't consented to. He'd thought about Robb. He'd thought about his father. He'd thought about all the things that kept being taken. Then he'd stopped, not because it didn't hurt. It did. It would keep hurting for a long time, probably forever, the way his father's death still had a presence in his chest like a scar that ached in cold weather. But grief without direction was just paralysis wearing a sad face. His brother had died and had signed a piece of paper before dying that said Jon Stark is the heir of Winterfell, and somewhere in the north, Roose Bolton was riding home with mud from the riverlands on his boots and a story about restoring order, and the Boltons' house words were "Our blades are sharp." Jon had been cold before. He'd walked back from the fist of the first men through a blizzard with whites behind him and men dying around him. He knew what it was to keep moving when every part of you wanted to stop. He walked into the yard as the sun came up and found Ghost waiting for him. The direwolf was enormous now, larger than any wolf anyone at Castle Black had seen, white as the wall itself and red-eyed in the early light. He pressed his great head against Jon's chest when Jon crouched in front of him, and Jon held the wolf's face in both hands and breathed. "We're going home," he said. Ghost's eyes were steady, knowing. Jon straightened up and looked around the yard. The watch was stirring, men heading to the cookhouse, men beginning the morning routines of sharpening and drilling and mending. Castle Black operating with the grim persistence of a garrison that knew the world didn't stop for anything. Dolorous Ed was carrying a bucket across the yard and stopped when he saw Jon's face. "You look like someone died," Ed said. "Multiple people died," Jon said. Ed put the bucket down. He was quiet for a moment, reading Jon's expression. He was better at reading people than he let on. "How bad?" "Robb, my mother." Something moved in Ed's face. He didn't say he was sorry because Ed Tollett didn't say things like that, not because he didn't mean them, but because he'd found through long experience that sorry was a word that did very little practical work. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Get Gren and Pip and Sam," Jon said. "I need to talk to all of you." Ed picked up his bucket. "Right," he said, and walked off to find them, which was as much of an answer as you ever got from Ed. They met in the common room, Jon, Ed, Gren, Pip, and Sam, who had arrived from somewhere bundled in 3 cloaks and still visibly cold, his round face red with it. Sam was also visibly alarmed, which was his factory setting, but Jon had come to understand that Sam's alarm was not weakness. Sam felt everything acutely and then thought his way through it, which was more than most people managed. Jon laid both letters on the table. He let them read. No one spoke for a moment. Outside, a horse whinnied in the stables. Gren made a sound that was not a word. "The North has no lord," Sam said, not quite to anyone. His voice had that particular quality it got when he was thinking out loud, stepping through facts like stones across a river. "Or, well, it has you. Robb's letter, I know," Jon said. "You're Jon Stark," Sam said. "That's legal. That's witnessed. The Citadel has a copy." "I know. Bolton will know it too," Pip said. He was very still, which was unlike him. "He sent a raven to everywhere he could think of. That means he'll have read the ravens going out from the twins too. He knows about the legitimization." "Yes," Jon said. "So he knows you exist," Pip said. "As an heir, as a threat." The word landed on the table between them. Gren had been frowning at the letters this whole time with the careful expression of a man who was slower to conclusions than the others, but who, when he arrived at them, held them very firmly. "Jon," he said, "what are we doing?" Jon looked at all of them. These men who had been his brothers in one sense of the word for 3 years now, Sam with his impossible courage hidden under all that softness, Gren who would walk through a fire for someone he decided to trust, Pip who laughed because the alternative was to despair, Ed who survived everything through the sheer stubborn power of low expectations. "I'm leaving Castle Black," Jon said. The silence that followed was not shock. They'd all been moving toward this since the letters arrived, Jon thought. It was more like standing at the edge of something and looking down. "Your vows," Sam started. "My vows were made by a bastard boy who had no family, no name, and no claim to anything," Jon said. "I have all 3 of those things now. My brother gave them to me before he died, and if I do nothing with them, then he died for nothing." He let that sit. "I'm not asking anyone to come. I want to be clear about that. You swore your own vows." Ed made a small sound. "Yeah, and look how well that's been going for us." Gren cracked his knuckles. "I didn't join the watch because I believed in it," he said. "I joined because a gold cloak wanted to hang me. If you're going, I'm going." "Gren, I'm going," Gren said with finality. Pip shrugged with an elaborate casualness that didn't fool anyone. "I always hated the cold anyway. If we're going south, that's practically a holiday." Sam was quiet. He was looking at the letters, chewing his lip, doing something complicated in his head. "If the Boltons take Winterfell," he said slowly, "and there's no counterclaim and no lord in the North to challenge them, the North is lost. Everything your father built, everything the Starks were." He paused. "And if there's a long night coming, and Jon, I think there might be, the North needs to be united. Not," he gestured at the letters, "not this." Jon said nothing because Sam had just said it all. "I'm coming," Sam said. "Obviously, I was always coming." Ed picked up his bucket again. "I'll go tell the horses we're leaving," he said. "They'll be thrilled, if by thrilled I mean miserable, which they will be." He walked out, and even in the middle of everything, the grief and the weight of it, the looming impossible task ahead, Jon found something that was not quite a smile but was related to one. He went to Maester Aemon last. The old man was sitting in his chair with a cup of tea going cold in his hands, and he didn't seem surprised when Jon ducked through the door. He never seemed surprised. Jon sometimes wondered if being blind had given him a different sense of arrival, the sound of footsteps, the shift of air, the way a person's presence had weight. "You're going," Aemon said. "Yes. Does Commander Thorne know?" Jon's jaw tightened. Alliser Thorne, who had hated him since the day he arrived at Castle Black, who had spent years looking for a reason to diminish him and found a good one in Jon's habit of being right. "Not yet. He'll call you deserter. He can call me whatever he wants." "I'm the Lord of Winterfell." The words came out steadier than he'd expected, more certain. Aemon heard something in them. Jon could tell from the slight tilt of his head, the attention. "Good," the old man said quietly. "You sound like you believe it." Jon stood in the doorway. "I need you to do something for me. If I can, send ravens to every northern lord you can reach. Tell them Robb Stark is dead. Tell them Jon Stark, legitimized heir to Winterfell, is riding south and calls them to stand for the North." He paused. "And send one to Castle Serwyn and Deepwood Motte first. Those are the closest. Send one to Bear Island." "Lyanna Mormont is 10 years old," Aemon said. Not an objection, just a fact. "The Mormonts have always stood for the Starks," Jon said. 10 years old is old enough to remember what she owes." Aemon considered. "And if Lord Bolton intercepts the ravens, then he knows I'm coming." "Good." Jon turned to go. "Maester Aemon." He stopped in the doorway, felt something he needed to say, some debt he needed to acknowledge. "Thank you for all of it." Aemon's expression was very still, and in it Jon could read something that might have been pride and might have been grief and was probably both. "Go, boy," Aemon said softly. "Go be a Stark." They rode out of Castle Black in the grey morning light, 6 of them, Jon, Ed, Gren, Pip, Sam, and a hard-faced free folk woman named Illa who'd been serving as a runner for the wall's garrison, and who had, on hearing Jon was riding south, simply appeared at the gate with a horse and a bone-handled knife and the specific expression of someone who has decided something is happening whether you like it or not. Jon had looked at her and said, "You don't have to." She'd said, "King Crow rides south. Free folk go where they want," and that was the end of that conversation. Ghost ran ahead, white and silent, and Jon watched the great wolf bounding through the snow-dusted landscape south of the wall, moving with that easy, tireless grace, and felt something settle in his chest alongside the grief. Not peace, nothing as comfortable as peace. Something harder than that, something cold and useful. He was Jon Stark. He had maybe 40 brothers who would come south if he asked, and he would ask. He had the free folk, who respected strength and had seen him stand at the top of the wall and face the dark and not flinch, and who might or might not follow a lord, but would absolutely follow a man they decided was worth following. He had a letter in his breast pocket with his dead brother's handwriting on it. He had Longclaw Valyrian steel, forged for killing and never yet truly tested. He had Ghost. He had the North if he could take it back. He rode through the grey morning and thought about Roose Bolton riding home in the opposite direction with blood on his hands and a plan already written in his head, and Jon thought, not this time, not again, not one more Stark. Pip rode up alongside him after a while. "So," Pip said, "what's the actual plan? And before you say take back the North, I need to know if there's a part B." Jon almost smiled. "Part B is take back Winterfell." "That's just part A again, worded differently." "Part C then," Jon said. "Make sure the Boltons understand what it means to lift a blade against a Stark." Pip was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "that's not really a plan, that's a threat." "Yes," Jon said. Pip seemed to turn that over. Something in his expression behind the habitual lightness had sharpened. "Right," he said, "I can work with that." They rode south. The wall receded behind them, immense and ancient and indifferent. Somewhere ahead, Roose Bolton was counting his pieces on a board he thought he owned. Somewhere ahead, Winterfell stood empty or occupied and waiting. And south of Winterfell and north of it and scattered across the broken kingdom of the north, people who remembered what a Stark meant were about to hear a name they hadn't expected to hear. Jon Stark, heir to Winterfell, coming home. The wolf ran ahead, and the cold wind came from the north at their backs like it was pushing them forward, and Jon rode into the winter morning and did not look back. Chapter 2, Homecoming in Steel. The village of Queenscrown had a name that was grander than the thing itself. A cluster of stone buildings around a crumbling tower that sat in the middle of a lake, connected to the shore by a causeway so narrow 2 horses couldn't pass abreast. Jon had ridden past it twice on rangings and never stopped. It had nothing worth stopping for. But it had walls and it had a fire, and the 7 of them had been riding for 2 days through weather that had gone from bitter to vindictive, so they stopped. The old man who came to the door looked at Ghost and then at Jon and then back at Ghost, and apparently decided that whatever was happening was above his authority to prevent, and let them in. They ate salt fish and hard bread around a fire that smelled of wet wood, and Jon spread a rough map across the table. Not a good map, one he'd had Maester Aemon copy quickly before they left, the proportions slightly wrong in places and the Dreadfort sitting maybe 10 miles from where it actually was, and looked at what stood between him and Winterfell. "Bolton left a garrison," Ed said. He was studying the map with the expression of a man inventorying a disaster. "He'd be stupid not to." "Bolton is not stupid," Jon said. "How many men?" Gren asked. "Maester Aemon's ravens got some answers before we left," Sam said. He pulled out his own notes, written in that cramped, careful hand of his, and smoothed them on the table beside the map. "Winterfell's been held since Theon Greyjoy took it. Ironborn garrison first, then the Bolton's men after. Ramsay Bolton burned it when he took it from the Ironborn." Everyone went quiet at that. Jon had heard about Winterfell's burning second-hand at a distance, filtered through rumors and dead men's words. He told himself it was stones. Stones could be rebuilt. He told himself that again now, and it worked about as well as it had the first time. "Ramsay Bolton," Pip said. He said the name carefully, like he was picking it up to see how much it weighed. "The bastard." "Legitimized, apparently," Sam said. "Or, well, Roose gave him the Bolton name." "As opposed to Jon," Ed observed, "who got his name from someone who hadn't just betrayed and slaughtered his king. I'm going to say Jon's legitimization has better moral standing." "The garrison," Jon said, pulling them back. Sam consulted his notes. "Somewhere between 40 and 100. Reports vary. The Boltons left enough to hold the castle, not enough to march on anyone. Winterfell's walls are still standing. Ramsay burned the keep and some of the towers, but the curtain walls held. 40 to 100, Gren said, and there are 6 of us. 7, said Illa without looking up from the bone she was cleaning. 7, Gren said. 7 against maybe 100. 7 now, Jon said. He'd been thinking about this for 2 days. Not when we get there. He tapped the map, north of Winterfell. The gift, the ranging lands, the territories closest to the wall where the Night's Watch held nominal authority over a scatter of villages and small keeps. And south of the wall, in the lands that had been granted for free folk settlement, 600 people, maybe more, who had crossed through the gate because Jon Snow had stood there and told them to, had faced down the Watch's bows and said these people pass, and they had believed him enough to walk through. The free folk won't go south of the wall, Pip said. Some will, Jon said. Tormund will. Tormund Giantsbane. Pip repeated the name with the specific energy of a man who found something both deeply impressive and deeply alarming. Right, and what do you plan to tell him? The truth, Jon said. That the people who want to keep all the land south of the wall, keep the castles and the crops and the warm holdings, are the same people who will put a spear in a free folk belly the moment they cross south of the gift. The Boltons won't share. He looked around the table. And that I will. Silence. The fire popped. You're going to give free folk land south of the wall, Sam said slowly. I'm going to give people who fight for me a reason to fight for me, Jon said. That's what lords do, Sam. The ones worth following anyway. Sam wrote something in his notes. Jon had a feeling Sam was going to be writing a lot of things in his notes over the coming months. Right, Ed said. So, find Tormund, convince free folk to go to war for a southerner. Take a castle with maybe a few hundred people against a garrison of potentially 100 trained soldiers. He paused. I've had worse Tuesdays. Tormund Giantsbane found them as it happened before Jon found him. He came out of the tree line on the 3rd morning with 9 men and 2 women at his back, all armed, all moving with the silent ground-eating stride of people who'd spent their lives in the open wild. He was exactly as Jon remembered him, enormous, red-bearded, grinning with the enthusiasm of a man who found most of life genuinely funny, which never quite masked the fact that he was also one of the most dangerous people Jon had ever met. He looked at Jon for a long moment, then at Ghost, then at the small company behind Jon. Heard you were riding South Crow, he said. You heard that in 3 days, Sam said, and then seemed to think about it. Right, free folk. Family got killed, Tormund said to Jon. It wasn't a question. His eyes had some understanding in them that hadn't come from ravens, it had come from looking at Jon's face. The brother. Yes, Jon said. The castle. Bolton men, Tormund turned his head and spat in the snow. That was his entire editorial on the Boltons. I'm going to take Winterfell back, Jon said, and then I'm going to take the North back, and the Boltons are going to answer for what they did at the Twins. What do I care about castles and Southerners killing each other? You don't, Jon said, but you care about land. You care about your people having somewhere to be that isn't north of the wall getting killed by things that don't stay dead. I win the North, your people get land, real land, granted, written down. He held Tormund's gaze. I keep my promises. You kept the gate open, Tormund said. Not agreement, just acknowledgement, a piece of evidence he was weighing. Yes, Tormund ran a hand through his enormous beard. He was thinking, which on his face looked remarkably similar to deciding he wanted another drink, but Jon had learned to tell the difference. How many men you need, Tormund said. How many can you bring? Tormund's grin came back like a sun coming from behind a cloud. Let me ask around, he said. They collected Tormund's fighters the way a river collects tributaries, slow at first, then faster. Word spread through the free folk settlements the way it always spread among them, person to person, faster than any raven because free folk didn't wait for paper. Jon Snow was riding south. Jon Snow had a castle to take. Jon Snow was offering land. Not every group came. Some didn't trust it. Some had their own feuds, their own reasons to stay, but enough came. By the time they reached the outskirts of the Wolfswood, the great forest that spread south and west of Winterfell like a dark cloak thrown across the hills, Jon had 43 Night's Watch brothers who'd ridden out from Castle Black in his wake, 67 free folk fighters led by Tormund, and the 7 who'd ridden with him from the start. 117 people, riding through the Wolfswood toward a castle they had varying degrees of emotional connection to. Jon sent scouts ahead. Tormund's people were better scouts than anyone the Watch had produced, for the simple reason that they'd spent their whole lives covering ground quietly and reading it when they got there. A woman named Carsey, sharp-eyed, quick-footed, with a knife that appeared in her hand so fast it seemed to materialize, came back on the 2nd day with a count. 63, she said. She was drawing in the snow with a stick while she talked. Maybe 5 more inside the tower, that one there, the one still standing, mostly posted on the walls. They've got horses in the yard, maybe 20. She paused. They're not ready for you. Meaning? Sam asked. Meaning they're bored, Carsey said, holding a ruin. No one's come near them in months. They've got a routine. She looked at Jon. Half of them are drunk by the second bell of evening. Jon looked at the scratch map in the snow, the walls, the gates, the remains of the towers. Drunk is better than sober, Gren offered. Only if you hit them before they can become the other thing, Jon said. He studied the layout. The main gate is too exposed, but he traced the eastern wall. Here. Ramsay burned the eastern guard tower when he took the castle from the Ironborn. Carsey, is the wall intact at the base of that tower? Carsey thought about it. The wall's cracked. There's a gap maybe this wide. She held her hands about 18 inches apart. A big man wouldn't fit, a regular man would. Tight, Pip said, but possible. Tormund won't fit, Ed observed. Tormund goes through the gate, Jon said, when it opens. Tormund looked up from his own study of the snow map. When do I open the gate? When I open it for you from the inside, Jon said. Tormund considered this. So your plan is you go through the small hole in the wall by yourself, not by myself, and fight 63 men while I wait outside. Fight through to the gate, Jon said. Not fight all 63. You come through the gate and we fight the rest together. What's the difference? The difference, Jon said, is that 63 men expecting nothing can't form up in a great hall before I'm already through it. They'll be in groups of 5 and 10 and 3. We hit them before they can think. Tormund was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, the big chest-rattling laugh that Jon had heard enough times now to know it was genuine. Crow fights like a free man, he said. Fine, I'll wait by the gate. You'll be cold, Ed said sympathetically. I'm always cold, Tormund said. That's what it means to be alive. They went in at the second bell of evening. Jon had left his cloak with Sam. It was black, and black was visible. He went through the gap in the eastern wall in leather and steel, Longclaw on his back, a short blade borrowed from Illa at his hip. Gren came through second, sideways, breathing out, scraping stone, swearing under his breath, and then Pip and Illa and 3 of the hardest of Tormund's fighters, a man with 1 eye and 2 women who moved like water. The eastern yard was empty. Torchlight from the main courtyard flickered over the top of the inner wall. Somewhere ahead, voices, a half-dozen men arguing about something, the specific shapeless sound of an argument that wasn't about anything important. Jon moved through the dark. He'd grown up in these walls. Not as they were now, broken and cold and smelling of ash and old char, but inside them. He knew where the stones were uneven. He knew where the echo carried. He knew that the eastern inner gate had a pin that stuck and you had to lift and push at the same time, and that the guard's post near the stables always faced inward during cold weather because the wind came from the north, and facing it all night was a particular kind of miserable. He went left along the inner wall, toward the stables, because the stables were where the horses were, and horses made noise when they were startled, and Jon needed the horses to stay quiet. There were 2 men at the stable door. Bolton livery, the flayed man on gray, visible even in the torchlight. They were standing close together for warmth, talking in the mumbling way of men who'd had this exact conversation 30 times and were having it again because there was nothing else to do. Jon came out of the dark and hit the first one with the pommel of his short blade, temple clean, the man folding without a sound. The second man turned and got his mouth open and Jon's forearm across his throat simultaneously, and the sound that came out was nothing because there was nothing to come out. He lowered him to the ground and looked at Gren. Gren looked at the 2 unconscious men and back at Jon. He mouthed, that fast. Jon moved on. The next 7 minutes were the longest of his life and also, in some strange way, the clearest. Everything came down to instinct, the lesson that Sir Roderick had drilled into him years ago, that real violence wasn't thought, it was pattern recognition, body memory, the 3 seconds of clarity before the conscious mind caught up with what was happening. He'd fought at the Fist of the First Men. He'd fought Quhor in Halfhand. He'd fought at Craster's Keep. He was not afraid of any of the men in this courtyard. 3 at the corner of the ruined towers, taken quickly, the one-eyed free folk fighter working in perfect silence with a blade that seemed to know exactly where necks ended and air began. 2 at the door of the main hall. Jon took one. Pip appeared from somewhere and took the other with a speed that Jon had always known Pip had, and which still somehow surprised him to see. Another one coming out of the barracks with the specific loose-limbed gait of a man recently awoken and not sure why, and Illa hit him with something heavy before he'd taken 2 steps. Jon reached the main gate. The mechanism was simple, a great crossbar and a wheel that let the portcullis up. Jon had operated it as a boy, helping the gate guards when he was 10, and decided that everything the guards did was interesting and he needed to be involved in all of it. He put his hands on the wheel. Someone behind him said, "Hey," not quietly, loud, alarm loud. Jon looked over his shoulder and saw a man, young, blonde, not drunk at all, full armor and his sword already clearing its scabbard with the smooth, unhurried movement of someone who'd actually been trained. Jon drew Longclaw. The man stopped. Everyone who'd never seen Valyrian steel did the same thing. The eye caught on it, the particular shimmer of it, darker than regular steel and somehow deeper, like light was going into it instead of coming off it. 1 second of hesitation. Jon used it. He was already moving on the first word, and the man was good, genuinely good. He parried the first cut and stepped inside and got his elbow up. But good wasn't the same as better, and Jon was better, had been better since he was 15, and fighting the older boys at Winterfell and winning, because Ned Stark's bastard had something to prove. 3 exchanges, Longclaw carving light in the dark courtyard, and then the man's sword was on the ground and Jon's blade was at his throat. "Open the gate," Illa said helpfully. "Yes," Jon said without taking his eyes off the disarmed guard. "Open the gate." She opened the gate. The wheel turned, the portcullis groaned upward, and Tormund came in with 67 people behind him like a tide coming in through a crack in a seawall, unstoppable once it had started. The fight didn't last long after that. There's a specific mathematics to it, to being woken from sleep or dragged from a dice game to find that the gate is open, and the courtyard is full of free folk, and there's a man with Valyrian steel standing in the center of it with an expression that says he has done harder things than this and found them easy. Most of the Bolton men chose sense over loyalty. They put down their weapons. A few didn't, and the result of those choices was what it always was. By the time the torches were fully lit and the smoke from the brief fighting had begun to clear, Jon was standing in the ruined courtyard of Winterfell with 100-and-something people at his back and 61 disarmed Bolton men sitting in a line against the eastern wall. He looked at the courtyard, at the burned shells of the towers, the skeleton of the great hall against the night sky. The stones were still there. The walls were still there. The heart tree would be in the godswood, he knew, white and watching and old beyond counting. Something moved in his chest that he didn't try to name. One of the Bolton men, older, broad, with a sergeant's bearing despite the blood on his cheek, looked up at Jon and said, "You're Snow, the bastard." "Stark," Jon said. "Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell." He let that sit for a moment. "Who commands here?" "Sir Walton Huxley. He's the one you bested at the gate." Jon looked along the line until he found the blond young man, sitting apart from the others, nursing the wrist Jon had disarmed, his expression complicated, embarrassed. But not broken. Jon had seen enough beaten men to know the difference between someone whose pride was wounded and someone whose spine was. He walked over and crouched down in front of him. Huxley looked up. "Go on then," he said. "Do what you're going to do." "What do you think I'm going to do?" "You're Stark. Bolton's killed your family." His chin came up slightly. "I'd be angry too." "Were you at the Twins?" Jon said. Huxley frowned. "Number I was here, holding this castle, same as I was ordered." Jon studied him. 22, maybe 23, capable, not a coward. Following orders because following orders was what you did when you didn't yet have enough information to know whose orders were worth following. "You can pledge to me," Jon said, "and garrison this castle under my banner, or you can take your men and walk south and we part without more blood between us." Huxley stared at him. "That's it, those are the choices, those are the choices. And if we pledge to you and Bolton comes with an army," Jon stood up, "then I'll deal with that when it comes." It wasn't the most reassuring answer in the world. Huxley seemed to know that. He also seemed, after a moment of looking at Jon's face, to decide that the lack of reassurance was in itself a kind of honesty he found more convincing than false promises. "I'll take the pledge," he said. And then with the air of a man trying to maintain some dignity, "The wrist, is it broken?" "Sprained," Jon said. "Sam will look at it." Sam, from somewhere behind Jon, said, "I'm not a maester," and then, at Jon's expression, "I'll look at it." They lit fires in what was left of the great hall that night. The roof was mostly gone at the eastern end, open to the stars, and the wind came through the gaps in a way that would have been miserable if Jon hadn't spent 3 years on the wall. He sat near the fire while around him the odd company of knights, watch brothers, and free folk, and newly pledged Bolton men sorted themselves out with the wariness of cats sharing space, sizing each other up, and the conversations that started with bristling and ended with someone passing a wineskin because warmth mattered more than faction on a night this cold. Gren dropped down beside him with 2 pieces of flat bread and a strip of dried meat. "Eat," he said. Jon ate. "We took the castle," Gren said. He sounded mildly disbelieving. "With 117 people." 118, Ed said, appearing from the dark. "I counted Huxley's pledge." "We took Winterfell," Gren said. "That's Jon, that's a thing." "It's a start," Jon said. "You could let it be a thing for a minute," Gren said, "before it becomes a start." Jon looked at the fire, tried to do what Gren was asking, to sit in the fact of it, to let Winterfell be Winterfell for a moment, not a strategic position, not the first move in a sequence. Just home. Just stone and fire and a night sky where the stars were bright and cold and very far away. He was sitting in Winterfell. He was sitting in Winterfell, and no Bolton man held it. He was sitting in his father's house. It lasted about 30 seconds before his mind went back to strategy. He figured that was probably fine. He suspected Ned Stark, if he was honest, had been the same kind of man. Sam settled cross-legged on the other side of the fire with his notes, which he'd been adding to all evening. I sent ravens, he said. Or Sir Huxley had a rookery, it's small but functional. I sent them to the northern lords the Maester mentioned. Castle Serwyn, Deepwood Motte, Bear Island, Last Hearth. He paused. And Carhold. The Karstarks hate us, Ed said. They hated Robb, Sam said carefully, because Robb executed Lord Rickard, but Jon never did anything to the Karstarks. Jon thought about it. Keep it in reserve. Karstark pride is specific. Send to Serwyn and Mormont first. What about the Umbers? Small Jon Umber is at the Twins, Sam said. Or was he went with the Great Jon and he stopped? Small Jon was at the massacre, Jon said. We don't know for certain, but if he survived, Jon said slowly, and the Boltons reach him before we do, they'll tell him a story, one that suits them. He looked at Gren. Who's our fastest rider? Carsey, Tormund said from across the fire. He had a habit of listening to conversations from 10 feet away that Jon had decided not to find disconcerting. She knows the northern roads. Send her to Last Hearth, Jon said. She doesn't go inside. Finds out who's there and comes back. Tormund relayed this to Carsey, who was sitting on the other side of the fire cleaning her knife and who nodded once without breaking her rhythm. What's our position? Pip said. Honestly, not strategically, honestly. Jon thought about that. We hold a ruined castle, he said. We have 120-something people, some of whom pledged to us 6 hours ago, and some of whom joined because I said free land, and that's a promise I'd better be able to keep. Roose Bolton is riding north with a much larger army, in the company of men who murdered my brother, and he knows I exist because he intercepted the ravens from the Twins. He paused. Somewhere between here and the south, the Lannisters are digesting what's happened and deciding how it suits them. Right, Pip said. So the honest answer is we're in trouble. The honest answer, Jon said, is that we're exactly where we need to be. Winterfell is the North's heart. Everyone knows it. Lords who were afraid to move against the Boltons before, afraid because there was nowhere to rally to, now have somewhere to go. He looked at all of them one by one around the fire. We're not hiding. We're not waiting. We're here. We took it. We hold it. And the North knows it the moment our ravens arrive. Outside, Ghost let out a sound, not a howl, just a low rumble, the sound he made when he was watching something move in the dark that he decided wasn't a threat but wanted noted. Jon listened to the silence after it. There's something else, Sam said. His voice had gone careful. I've been thinking. Roose Bolton participated in a massacre. He violated guest right. In the North, he looked around at the Watch brothers, the free folk, the curious faces turned toward him from across the fire. In the North, that's not just a crime, that's an offense against the gods themselves. Violating guest right is the worst thing a man can do under the old gods. People know this, Jon said. People know it, but people are afraid, Sam said. What I mean is, you don't just have a political claim to Winterfell, you have a moral one. Roose Bolton can't be Lord of the North because he murdered his king at a dinner table. No lord in the North, he stopped, reconsidered. No lord worth the name will follow him willingly once they let themselves say that out loud. The fire crackled. Someone somewhere was playing a rough bone flute, a free folk tune that Jon half recognized from his time beyond the wall, something sad and wild and stubborn. Give them someone to rally to, Jon said, and they'll say it out loud. Sam nodded. You're already doing it. Jon stood because sitting felt wrong, felt like waiting. He moved to the edge of the firelight and looked out at the courtyard, at the broken towers, at the scorch marks on the stones, at the parts of Winterfell that had been burned away. The Godswood was east. He could feel it the way you felt a church when you stood near one, even with your eyes closed, some weight to the air. He needed to go there, not yet, not tonight with everyone watching. In the morning, alone, or as alone as you could be with a direwolf as your shadow. Get some sleep, he said to the group. Tomorrow we start the real work. The real work, Ed repeated. Can't wait. You'll be building barracks, Jon said. Great, said Ed. At least I'll die doing something I hate. That's very on brand for me. He woke before dawn and went to the Godswood. Ghost came with him, padding silently through the dark corridors, through the little gate in the inner wall, into the trees. The Godswood was exactly as he remembered, the ancient trees, the black pool, the heart tree with its carved face caught in that expression of permanent watching sorrow. Snow had settled on the weirwood's red leaves and melted against the white bark and run down in long red lines like old blood. Jon knelt at the pool's edge. He wasn't sure what he believed. He'd knelt at this tree his whole childhood because his father had, because the Starks always had, because there was something about the red carved eyes that felt like being seen. He'd prayed here before going to the wall. He'd prayed here, not so different from talking out loud to someone he wasn't sure was listening, but meaning it anyway. He knelt now. I don't know if you hear any of this, he said quietly. I don't know if there's anything there to hear. He looked at the face in the bark, but I'm here. I'm in your house and I'm going to do what I can. He paused. Robb, mother, father, whoever is listening, I'm going to keep what's left. Ghost sat beside him, red-eyed and white, reflected in the black water. The face in the tree watched without moving. The first pale gray light was beginning to find its way through the winter-bare branches. Jon stayed there for a while, just breathing. Then he stood up because there was work to do. When he walked back into the yard, Sam was already up and had apparently, through some alchemy that Jon didn't fully understand, produced a steaming cup of something and was standing at the gate to the yard looking at a man who had arrived in the night. A man on a bay horse, gray-cloaked, with a raven's feather stitched to his collar that was the sign of a Maester's runner. Sam turned when he heard Jon's footsteps. His expression was unreadable, which was unusual for Sam, whose expressions were generally a complete and transparent record of what was happening in his mind. Letter, Sam said, from Bear Island, fast, almost too fast, which means she sent it before our raven even arrived. Jon took the letter. The handwriting was a child's, carefully formed, with none of the slack of an adult who decided that perfect penmanship was something other people worried about. 10 years old, Maester Aemon had said. Every line was very precisely written, like a person who understood that the only compensation for small hands was deliberate clarity. Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, my mother served your mother's family. My grandmother served your grandmother. The Mormonts of Bear Island have always known who our friends are and who our enemies are. I heard about the Red Wedding. I heard about you. Bear Island knows no king but the king in the north, whose name is Stark. We are 62 swords. They are yours. Lyanna Mormont. Jon read it twice. 62 swords. From a 10-year-old girl on an island at the edge of the world who had apparently decided, with the simple certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to be political about it, exactly which side she was on. He looked at Sam. Sam was very clearly trying not to smile. 62 swords, Jon said. From Bear Island, Sam said. She's 10. She's a Mormont, Sam said, like that explained everything, which it sort of did. Jon folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket alongside Robb's, 2 letters now. He thought they might be the beginning of something, a collection, a growing weight of names and blades and people who decided to say yes when the easier thing was to say nothing. He looked up at the sky, where the morning was coming in cold and clear, and the sun was making its grudging winter appearance over the eastern walls of Winterfell. The North was listening. He just had to make sure it liked what it heard. Chapter 3. The North remembers the first northern lord to arrive at Winterfell's gates came not from a raven, but from rumor. Lord Clay Serwyn rode in on the 5th day with 40 horsemen, and a face full of barely contained emotion, not grief exactly, more the expression of a man who'd been holding something in for months and had finally been given permission to put it down. He was 20 years old, inheriting his father's seat because his father had died of the same fever that killed half the Serwyn garrison 2 years prior, and he'd spent those 2 years watching the Boltons consolidate the North with the frustrated helplessness of someone who knew something was wrong but had no lever to pull. He rode through Winterfell's gates and saw Jon in the yard and dismounted in one motion and said without preamble, "Tell me it's true. Tell me a Stark holds Winterfell." "A Stark holds Winterfell," Jon said. Serwyn's shoulders dropped about 2 inches. It was the most eloquent thing Jon had ever seen a body do. They ate in the remains of the great hall, the part with the roof still on, and Jon answered Serwyn's questions with the directness he'd decided from the start would be his policy. No politics, no careful phrasing. The Starks had always dealt plain with their bannermen, and the bannermen had always respected it, and this was not a time for anyone to be guessing at what their lord meant. He told Serwyn about the letter, about the ride south, about the taking of the castle. He told him about the free folk and watched Serwyn absorb that with the visible effort of a man rearranging furniture in his head to make room for a new piece. "The free folk are here," Serwyn said. "They held the eastern wall last night," Jon said. "They'll hold it tonight. Lords won't like it. Lords who want to keep waiting for the Boltons to be kind to them are welcome to keep doing that," Jon said. "Lords who want to take the North back can come here and hold their nose for a fortnight and discover that free folk bleed and die same as anyone." He picked up his cup. "Which lords have you heard from?" Serwyn leaned forward, dropping his voice the way men did when they were about to say something that had been a secret long enough to develop weight. "Glover is furious. Robert Glover's been at Deepwood Motte since the Ironborn took it back. He wants blood. Hornwood lands are contested, the Riswells are sniffing at the borders, the Umbers." He stopped. "Say it," Jon said. "Small Jon Umber was at the Twins," Serwyn said. "He made it out. Word is he rode hard north and got back to Last Hearth 3 days ago. But the story he's telling," he paused. Jon Bolton got to him first. Someone met him on the road, told him the massacre was Robb's fault, that Robb insulted the phrase one too many times. That Bolton is riding north to restore order and will deal fairly with the Umbers. Jon set down his cup. Small Jon's not stupid. No, Serwyn said, but he watched men he knew get killed at dinner. And grieving men who are angry will grab whatever story fits in their hand. Bolton's man found him when he was still shaking from it. He spread his hands. I don't know where the Umbers stand. Jon thought about the Umbers. The Great Jon had been one of Robb's most loyal men, taken prisoner at the Green Fork. Small Jon was a different creature, less thunderous, more internal. He could be turned. He could also be reached. I'll send someone, Jon said, in person, not a raven. Who? Jon thought of Tormund, number not for this particular errand. He thought of Pip, who could charm a stone into a conversation. He thought of Sam, who had a way of making people feel like he was on their side even when he was arguing with them, because his belief in facts was so obviously genuine it was hard to take personally. Sam, he said. Across the hall, Sam looked up from his notes with the expression of a man who just heard his name in a sentence with consequences. Me, he said. You're going to Last Hearth, Jon said. I'm going to the Umber seat, alone. Take Pip. Oh well, that fixes everything, Sam said, but he was already writing something down, which was how Sam processed the gap between what he feared and what he would do. More ravens came, more letters followed. Robert Glover arrived 2 days after Serwyn with 60 infantry and the expression of a man who had been personally wronged by the state of the world and intended to do something about it. He was blunt and capable and shook Jon's hand with the grip of someone testing the structural integrity of it, and said, I fought for your brother. I'll fight for you. Don't waste us, which Jon found refreshing. Lady Lyanna Mormont arrived a week after that. Jon had known she was coming, the 62 swords she'd promised, riding south from the port on the western coast. What he had not entirely prepared for was the person herself. She was small, with dark eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that had decided very early that the world was serious business and had never really changed their mind. She was 10 years old. She rode her horse like she was doing it a favor. She walked into what remained of Winterfell's great hall, looked around at the burned stone and the patched roof and the mix of Night's Watch black and free folk leather and Northern Lord's livery and said, needs work. I know, Jon said. She looked at him. He had the strange experience of feeling assessed, which was not new, but which had a different quality when coming from someone who reached his mid-chest. My mother said Starks were worth following, she said. My grandmother said the same. Your family has always honored us, Jon said. I don't take that lightly. Good, she said. She looked around the hall again. Who's the fat one taking notes? That's Sam Tarly, Jon said. He's the smartest person here. Lyanna considered that. He looks nervous. He's always nervous, Jon said. He does it anyway. That's actually braver than most. Something shifted in her expression, barely perceptible. All right, she said, and went to find a seat, and that apparently was the extent of the social ceremony required by Lyanna Mormont before she got down to business. Tormund watched her cross the hall and then looked at Jon with the expression of a man who has just recognized a specific kind of person. That one, he said, is going to be trouble. Good trouble, Jon said. Is there another kind? Tormund said and went back to his dinner. By the end of the second week at Winterfell, Jon had 412 fighters. Not enough for a battle against Roose Bolton's army, not even close. But enough to hold the castle, enough to train with, enough to look like something, and looking like something mattered. It was the first piece of military psychology that Sir Roderick had ever taught him. A man who looks beaten already is half beaten. Make them believe the fight is possible and they'll fight like it is. He drilled them himself. Every morning before the sun was fully up, in the cleared yard with frost on the ground and breath visible in the cold air, Jon put the mixed company of Night's Watch and free folk and northern levies through their paces with a relentlessness that was not cruelty but was also not gentle. He fought anyone who wanted to spar, and he fought them properly, no pulling, no obvious mercy. He beat Robert Glover's best swordsman in about 40 seconds, and then spent 30 minutes showing the man exactly what he'd done wrong. He sparred with Tormund twice, and the second time it went long enough that people stopped what they were doing to watch, which was what Jon had wanted. He needed them to know who he was, not through proclamations. Through this, on the 15th day, Carsey came back from her ride to Last Hearth. She came in fast, her horse blowing hard, and found Jon on the training ground. She didn't waste time. Bolton's man is there, she said, at Last Hearth, lodged with the Umbers. Big man, blonde, with the flayed man on his armor. She paused, and there's something else. Umbers got prisoners. Riverland's men looked like taken from the road. Prisoners, Jon said, 3 of them. They were asking for you, is what I heard, through the walls. Her expression was flat, but her eyes were sharp. They knew your name. Jon looked at her. How long ago did Sam and Pip leave? 4 days. They were already at Last Hearth, or nearly. Jon made a decision in about 3 seconds. Tormund, he said. Tormund looked up from the whetstone he was running along his axe blade. How fast can 20 of your people travel light? Faster than anyone else, Tormund said, which was not a number but was an answer. Get them ready. We ride in 2 hours. They made Last Hearth in 2 days, traveling hard through the northern forest, the kind of riding that made your legs hurt and your back ache and your temper get very short. Jon rode at the front with Ghost running ahead, ranging wide, coming back, ranging again. The direwolf's behavior was readable now. When he ran ahead and came back quickly, something was wrong. When he ranged slow and far, the path was clear. He came back fast twice on the second day, and Jon slowed the company and sent scouts, and both times found Bolton patrols on the road. Not Umber patrols, Bolton men, wearing another lord's colors on another lord's land. Jon looked at the second patrol, 4 men watching the road from a copse of trees, and felt something harden in him. Not anger exactly, just clarity. Roose Bolton had been north long enough to have men posted between Last Hearth and Winterfell, which meant Bolton moved faster than Jon had counted on, which meant the calculation had to shift. He left the Bolton men where they were. Coming at them would announce his presence. He went around. Last Hearth was a squat, ugly castle. The Umbers had never much cared for aesthetics, sitting in a clearing hacked out of the forest, wide-walled and practical, built for the single purpose of keeping the people inside it alive in a landscape that was consistently trying to prevent that. The gates were closed, smoke from 3 chimneys. A banner Jon didn't recognize hanging beside the Umber sigil gray, with a device he couldn't read at distance. Sam and Pip were outside the walls. Not outside by choice, they were sitting under a tree about 200 yards from the gate, guarded by 2 Umber men who appeared moderately bored with the assignment, which told Jon they'd been there a while. Jon rode up and the Umber guards looked at him, and then at the 20 free folk riders at his back, and then at Ghost, whose shoulder came up to the belly of Jon's horse, and made the entirely sensible decision to remain very still. Sam, Jon said. Sam looked up. He had a cut above his left eye that was mostly healed, which told Jon it was at least 3 days old. He had also apparently, during his captivity, continued taking notes, because he had his little book open in his lap and a stylus in his hand. He looked at Jon with an expression of profound relief that he was clearly trying to disguise as professional calm. Lord Stark, Sam said. Good timing. What happened? We were invited in, Pip said. He was sitting with his back against the tree and his arms crossed. He had no visible injuries, which either meant he hadn't tried to fight anyone or he'd been very good about not getting hit. Then Bolton's man convinced Lord Umber that we were lying about who sent us. Then we were guests in a less comfortable sense of the word. He paused. Small Jon's not sure what to believe. He's not sure, Jon said. That's different from having decided. That's what I said, Sam said, and pointed at his notes as if to prove it. Jon dismounted. He handed Ghost's lead. There was no lead. Ghost did not wear a lead, but he made a gesture that communicated the general idea to Tormund, who didn't look entirely comfortable with this arrangement, and walked to the gate. He knocked on it with his fist 3 times loud. A slot opened. 2 eyes appeared. I'm Jon Stark, Jon said, Lord of Winterfell. Tell Small Jon Umber I'd like a word. The slot closed. He waited. It opened again 10 minutes later, and this time it was the gate itself, swinging inward, and the man standing in it was Small Jon Umber, who was not as large as his father. The great Jon had been a genuine giant of a man, but who was large enough, 6 feet and change, broad in the chest, with the specific build of a man who didn't exercise so much as just lived physically, and had ended up as a result built like a siege weapon. He looked at Jon. His expression was doing several things at once: assessment, suspicion, something that might have been hope, and was fighting not to show it. You're the bastard, Small Jon said. Stark, Jon said, not angry, just correcting the record. Small Jon's jaw worked. You've got the wolf, he said. That's the direwolf. His name's Ghost. Small Jon looked at Ghost for a long moment, then back at Jon. Show me the letter, he said. Jon took Robb's letter from his breast pocket and held it out. Small Jon took it, read it again. His face was doing less now. The assessment was resolving into something. Jon watched him arrive somewhere. Bolton's man, Small Jon said, not quite to Jon, told me the Red Wedding was fray business. That Bolton only survived because he was in the latrine when it started. He looked up. But Bolton's man got to me before I'd slept, before I'd eaten, before I was. He stopped. I want to know what you know, Jon told him, all of it plainly, without decoration, what the unsigned raven had said, what Maester Aemon had inferred, the way Bolton's own letter had arrived with extraordinary speed and convenient framing. He told Small Jon about riding south and taking Winterfell. He didn't make it a speech. He just laid it out like evidence on a table. Small Jon was quiet for a long time. My father is a Lannister prisoner, he said. I know, Jon said. If I stand against the Boltons and we lose, I know, Jon said again. Do you? Small Jon looked at him with something sharp in his eyes, not aggressive, just direct. My father dies if the Lannisters decide he's worth more dead than alive. My people get the Boltons' attention. Umber men end up with that. He couldn't say it. He gestured at his own skin where Bolton's heraldry would have been. Jon held his gaze. I can't promise you there's no risk, he said. I won't. Anyone who tells you there's no risk is trying to sell you something. He paused. But I can tell you that doing nothing has its own cost. Every day Bolton consolidates, it gets harder. Every lord who watches and waits makes it easier for Bolton to pick them off one by one. He stepped forward slightly. Your father followed mine. Your father followed Robb. Leave the Starks were worth the risk. I'd rather earn that than ask for it, but I'm asking anyway. Small Jon was still for a long moment. Behind Jon, from outside the gate, Tormund said something in the old tongue to one of his riders. A horse stamped. The wind moved through the clearing. Then Small Jon Umber held out his hand. Jon took it. The grip was what he'd expected. Bolton's man, Jon said, looking at the guards behind Small Jon. He's in the guest chambers, Small Jon said, comfortable. Keep him there, Jon said, comfortable. Let him think he's winning. When I need him to carry a message back to Bolton, I want him to be rested. Small Jon raised an eyebrow. What message? Not yet, Jon said. First, tell me about your prisoners. The 3 men from the Riverlands turned out to be survivors of the Red Wedding, not soldiers but servants, a steward and 2 kitchen boys who'd managed to get out through a pantry door during the slaughter and had been running north ever since, following rumors of Jon Stark the way drowning men followed light. They were young, thin, clearly terrified, and they carried something with them that Jon had not expected. The steward, a thin man named Lew with clever eyes and shaking hands, handed Jon a small oilskin-wrapped package when they were alone in the room Small Jon had provided. Inside the oilskin was a letter. Lady Catelyn, Lew said. She gave it to me the night before the wedding. Said if anything happened, I was to find her son Jon and give it to him and no one else. He looked at Jon. She called you her son. I didn't know. I thought the bastard was at the wall. The letter, Jon said. He didn't want to look at it. He also could not look at it. He held it in both hands and looked at his mother's handwriting, Lady Catelyn's handwriting, the woman who had never loved him, who had resented him from the first day she'd had to look at him, who was the only consistent reminder in his childhood that he was not entirely wanted in the house he called home. He opened it. It was short. She'd written it fast, the letters slightly uneven, the pressure of the pen heavier than normal, the writing of someone for whom time had just become suddenly precious. Jon, if you're reading this, the worst has happened. I want to say I'm sorry. I never said it when I could have, and I should have, and I will not waste whatever time remains pretending otherwise. You are your father's son. You were always your father's son. I was not always fair to you, and you never gave me any cause for it. Winterfell is yours by right and by Robb's will. Take it. Hold it. Don't be careful, be brave, the way your father was brave, the way Robb was brave. Take care of the girls if you can. Lady Catelyn Tully Stark. Jon sat with the letter for a while, just sat. There was grief in it, a complicated, uncomfortable grief, the kind that came with unresolved things that would now stay unresolved forever, the conversation that would never be had. He'd spent years being angry at her and had been certain, with the certainty of a teenager, that she'd spend those same years never changing, and she had changed. At the end, alone and afraid in a castle full of people who were about to kill her son, she had written him a letter and told the truth. Too late, but not worth nothing. He folded it and put it with Robb's letter against his chest. Lew was watching him carefully from across the room. She also told me something, he said. Before she gave me the letter, I don't know what it means, she said. He frowned, working through the exact phrasing. She said she'd learned something at King's Landing when Lord Baelish told her things. She said she'd always thought Lord Eddard's. She said she'd always thought the secret he kept was a shame, but that she'd come to think it was the opposite. He spread his hands. She said she thought Lord Eddard kept the secret to protect someone, not to hide something. Jon looked at him. I don't know what that means, Lew said again. Jon said nothing for a moment. Some part of his mind was reaching for the edge of something, a thought he couldn't quite close his hand around. A secret Ned Stark had kept to protect someone, not to hide something shameful, but to protect. Thank you, Jon said quietly, for bringing this north, for finding me. Lew exhaled, the long exhale of a man who'd been carrying something and had finally put it down. What do I do now? He said. Can you fight? Jon said. Badly. Can you cook? Lew's eyes shifted slightly. Yes, actually. Then you're the most valuable person in my army, Jon said, and meant it, because he had 150 people who needed feeding and 3 people doing the cooking, and one of them was Ed, whose approach to food preparation was deeply influenced by his general philosophy about life. They rode back to Winterfell with the Umber men folded in, 80 of them, solid northern infantry. the kind who'd been fighting things in the dark northern forests their whole lives and had opinions about it. The Bolton man they left at last hearth with a polite message that Lord Umber was detaining him for his own safety, which would buy maybe a week before Bolton's patience ran out. Jon used the week. He had now just over 500 fighters. Still not enough for a field engagement against Bolton's full strength. Roose Bolton was riding north with what reports suggested was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men, veterans of the war in the Riverlands, hardened and professional. Jon couldn't match that in the field yet, so he wasn't going to fight in the field. He gathered his captains, Serwyn, Glover, Small Jon Umber, Tormund, Sir Walton Huxley, and Lyanna Mormont, who attended every war council with the silent intensity of someone taking a master class, around the table in the great hall with Sam's map spread between them, and he laid out what he was thinking. Bolton's strength is numbers, Jon said, and the story he's telling, he wants to walk into the north as the man restoring order. He needs to arrive before anyone can contest that version of events. He tapped the map. He's on the King's Road, moving north. He'll reach the neck in 4 days, clear it in 6, and then he's on open road to Winterfell. He paused. Winterfell changes his calculation. He can't just walk past, Robert Glover said. No, Jon said, he has to take it back. Because if he doesn't, every day we hold it is a day the story shifts. He's not restoring order, he's besieging the rightful lord. He looked around. What does a siege cost him? Time, Serwyn said. Men, Small Jon said. Legitimacy, Sam said quietly from the corner where he was doing a spectacular job of being invisible until he said something that mattered. Every day he sits outside Winterfell's walls, the narrative is the Bolton is attacking the Stark, not the Stark attacking the Bolton. People who haven't decided yet will decide. And we're not staying inside the walls waiting for him, Jon said. A brief silence. Say that again, Glover said. We don't sit in Winterfell and wait, Jon said. We raid his supply lines, we hit his outriders. We move fast and don't commit to a position, make him think we're larger than we are, make him paranoid about where we'll hit next. Drain him before the real engagement. He looked at Tormund. This is what free folk do. Tormund grinned. This is what free folk do, he agreed. You're talking about a harassment campaign, Serwyn said. That's yes, it works if we have enough mobility, but if he sends a full column after us, he won't, Jon said, because I'm going to give him something else to worry about. What? Small Jon said. Jon looked at Sam. Tell them about the letter. Sam cleared his throat. Yes, so. He unfolded a piece of parchment. Lord Stark is sending word to every northern lord who hasn't yet declared, and the message isn't going to be a call to arms. He looked at the assembled captains. It's going to be a charge. It's going to say that Roose Bolton violated guest right, that he murdered his king at a dinner table, that any lord who shelters him, feeds him, opens his gates to him is participating in that violation. He looked up. Under the old gods, that's not a political position, that's a spiritual one. It will force lords who want to stay neutral to make a choice they can't dress up as prudence. The hall was quiet. The letter goes out today, Jon said. Bolton sees it in a week, and he arrives at Winterfell's gates already knowing that every lord between here and the neck has received it and is deciding. Lyanna Mormont, who had not spoken during the entire council, looked up from the map. He'll try to buy them, she said. Bolton, he'll send ravens too, offer things, lands, positions. He will, Jon agreed. What do we offer that he can't match, she said. Jon looked at her. She was 10 years old and she had cut directly to the most important question in the room. Honor, he said. And then, because he could see that didn't quite satisfy her, and the knowledge that when I win, and I will win, every lord who stood with me keeps what he has, and every lord who stood with Bolton answers for it. Bolton can offer them prizes. I offer them safety and a clean conscience. That's not nothing in a north that's been filthy with bad decisions for 2 years. Lyanna held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once with the decisive finality that was apparently her default mode and went back to studying the map. The Dreadfort, Glover said. He was looking at the map with something in his expression that Jon recognized, an old grievance, the specific shape of an anger that had been patient. While Bolton moves south, who holds the Dreadfort, Jon had been thinking about this. A skeleton garrison, he said. He wouldn't leave significant forces there when he needs everything he has moving north. So it's undefended, Glover said. Not undefended. Underdefended, Jon looked at the map. The Dreadfort sat east of Winterfell, a day's hard ride, a castle that was by all accounts as cheerful as its occupants had ever been. Leaving it standing behind our lines is a liability. If Bolton moves north and we can't stop him from reaching Winterfell, he could detach forces to retake the Dreadfort and we'd be fighting on 2 fronts. So we take it now, Small Jon said. The enthusiasm in his voice was extremely specific. The Umbers and the Boltons had a history that was long and mutual and mostly about who had raided whose villages most recently. We take it, Jon said. Fast, clean. Before Bolton is close enough to send reinforcements. He looked at Glover. Robot, you're the fastest mover I have. Take 150, cavalry heavy. You don't stop to garrison, you go in, clear it, and come back. I want you back here in 5 days. Glover straightened. He had the look of a man who'd just been given something he'd wanted for a long time. 5 days, he said. We'll do it in 4. Do it in 4, Jon agreed, and I'll owe you a very good dinner. I'll hold you to that, Glover said. They sent the letter that afternoon, the charge against Bolton, the summons to stand against the violation of guest right, the call in the name of the old gods and the honor of the North. Sam had written 12 copies in a neat, precise hand and addressed each one personally, which Jon thought was exactly the right detail, the difference between a broadsheet nailed to a door and a letter from someone who knew your name. Robert Glover rode east at dawn with 150 mounted men and an expression of absolute purpose. Jon stood on the walls of Winterfell and watched him go. Tormund came up beside him. You're worried, Tormund said. I'm thinking, Jon said. When you think it looks the same as when you're worried. That's because thinking and worrying are closely related activities, Jon said. Tormund leaned on the wall, looking east. The big man, he said, his designation for Roose Bolton, whose actual name he'd used exactly once. He planned this for a long time. Yes, Jon said. Men who plan for a long time have planned for the things you think of, Tormund said. They haven't planned for the things you don't think of until you're in the moment. Jon looked at him. What are you saying? I'm saying use what you have, the wolf, the wall brothers, me. He patted his axe. And stop standing on walls thinking about what Bolton planned. Make him think about what you're planning. Jon was quiet for a moment. You know, for a man who once told me reading was for people who'd given up on living, you're surprisingly good at strategy. I've been raiding for 30 years, Tormund said not modestly. It's just strategy without the words. Ghost appeared below them in the yard, looking up, red-eyed and still. Jon looked down at the direwolf and thought about what Tormund had said. Use what you have. He had Winterfell. He had the North beginning to turn, beginning to say out loud the thing they'd all been afraid to say. He had 500 fighters and Glover moving on the Dreadfort and Sam's letters in the air. And somewhere south, Roose Bolton was riding north, counting pieces on a board he thought he understood. Jon turned from the wall. I need to write a letter, he said. Tormund watched him go. More letters, he said, to no one in particular. Crows and their letters. The letter Jon wrote that evening was not to a northern lord. It was addressed to King's Landing, sealed with the Stark direwolf, and it said precisely 3 things. It said that Roose Bolton had participated in the murder of the king in the north, a guest under his own host's roof, which was a violation of a sacred law so old it predated the Andal invasion and would not be tolerated by any Stark, living or yet to be born. It said that Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, held no grudge against the crown for what the Freys and Boltons had chosen to do on their own account, and requested only that the crown make no move to confirm Bolton's claim over the North, as the North had its own lord and its own arrangements. And it said in a postscript in a hand slightly different from the main body of the letter, a hand Jon had borrowed because he needed it to be recognized. Lady Sansa, I'm alive, I'm coming, hold on. He sealed it and gave it to the Raven Keeper and watched it go, a black dot against the gray winter sky, flying south. Then he went to the yard, found Gren, and they sparred for an hour in the cold until Jon's mind was empty of everything except the mechanics of blade and body, the clean simplicity of a problem that had only one solution and you could feel it in your hands. When he stopped, sweating despite the cold, and looked up at the sky, it was dark and full of stars, and the wall was north, and somewhere south a raven was flying with his sister's name on it. He was alive. He was home. He was not finished. Chapter 4: The Viper and the Wolf. King's Landing smelled like it always did, shit and salt water, and the particular sweetness of too many people living too close together in a city that had never quite managed to clean itself between disasters. Sansa Stark had stopped noticing the smell around the 4th month. Now she only noticed it when the wind came off the bay at a certain angle and reminded her that somewhere beyond the smell and the noise and the Red Keep's towers there was open water, and beyond the open water was somewhere else. She thought about somewhere else a great deal. She was sewing when the letter arrived. Not because she enjoyed sewing, she had never particularly enjoyed sewing, despite years of being told that she should, but because sewing was the sort of activity that produced no intelligence, that gave watchers nothing to worry about, that looked exactly like what a captive highborn girl was supposed to do. She had learned to weaponize harmlessness. It had taken her a long time and cost her things she didn't like to think about, but she'd learned it. The letter came through she, who was still nominally her handmaiden, who had developed a talent for moving through the Red Keep with things tucked inside her bodice that people hadn't given her permission to carry. She set a cup of tea beside Sansa's elbow and said very quietly, "Sparrow brought something to the kitchens, for you, specifically for you." And then she went to the window and looked out of it with great interest while Sansa put down her sewing. The letter was small, rolled tight, sealed with wax that had been pressed by a thumb rather than a signet ring, and inside the wax, barely visible, the ghost of a mark that Sansa spent a moment working out and then felt her breath stop. A direwolf, pressed by a thumb. Not an official seal, just someone who had the seal, who wanted her to know where it came from. She read it standing up, facing the wall so that anyone at the door would see her back and not her face. She read it twice. "I'm alive, I'm coming, hold on." She stood very still for about 10 seconds, then she sat back down, picked up her sewing, and continued working on the seam she'd been halfway through. Her hands were completely steady. She had trained her hands to be steady. The face above them was another matter, but she was facing the wall, and by the time she turned around she had that under control too. Jon was alive, Jon was at Winterfell, Jon was coming. She had been holding on for so long that the instruction itself almost made her laugh, hold on, as if she'd had any other choice. As if holding on wasn't the single most sophisticated thing she'd done every day for the past year. The constant terrible work of staying sane and soft enough to be unthreatening and hard enough inside not to shatter. Wearing a face for Cersei and a different face for Joffrey and a third face for Tyrion, who was kind in ways she hadn't known how to trust yet, and now a fourth face for everyone who watched her because watching Sansa Stark had become a minor sport in King's Landing. She pressed the letter against her chest for exactly 2 seconds. Then she burned it in the candle. Oberyn Martell arrived in King's Landing 3 weeks before Sansa's letter came, and his arrival had the quality of a stone dropped into still water. The ripples went outward fast and touched everything. Sansa knew him by reputation the way everyone knew him by reputation. The Red Viper, Prince of Dorne, a man who had seduced half the nobility of 3 continents and killed a significant portion of the other half, who carried a spear instead of a sword because the spear was faster in his hands, who had arrived in the capital with his paramour and his daughters and a specific score to settle that he made absolutely no effort to hide. She'd watched him at dinner from across the hall, watched him exist in a room the way a fire existed in a room, making everything else arrange itself around him without seeming to try. He'd caught her watching, had held her gaze with dark, intelligent eyes that were reading her the way she'd read his letter, looking for what was useful. 2 days later in the garden by the eastern wall where Sansa walked in the afternoons because it was the only place in the Red Keep that felt like something other than a gilded cage, marginally, he was simply there. Sitting on a bench as if he'd been there for years, eating an orange, watching a bird on the wall above. "Lady Sansa," he said without looking at her. She sat down 2 feet away. The guard at the garden gate was looking at the gate, not the garden. Someone had arranged that. "Prince Oberyn," she said. "What a terrible place this is," he said pleasantly. He finished the orange, dropped the peel beside the bench. "I've been to 100 cities. This one has a particular talent for making people feel watched." "You get used to it," Sansa said. "You shouldn't have to." He looked at her now, direct, measuring, with none of the performance about it. She'd been around enough performance to know the difference. "Your brother is at Winterfell." She kept her face perfectly still. "I don't have any brothers alive," she said, the practiced answer, the safe answer. "Your brother," Oberyn said again, unhurried, "sent a letter to King's Landing, addressed to the Crown. It arrived 3 days ago and Varys has a copy and Cersei has a copy and I have a copy because I paid someone's debt to have a copy." He tilted his head slightly. He made no mention of a sister in the letter itself, but he sealed it with a Stark direwolf. Which is interesting, given that the Starks are supposed to be finished. Sansa looked at the bird on the wall. It was a thrush, ordinary and small, going about its business. "Lord Bolton will come north," Oberyn continued, "with his army, and Jon Stark will fight him and one of them will win. That's the obvious shape of it." He paused. "What is less obvious is what happens in King's Landing while that particular drama unfolds." "What are you suggesting?" Sansa said. He smiled. It was a genuine smile. She was good at identifying genuine now. She'd been practicing on the crueler examples long enough. "I'm not suggesting anything," he said. "I'm observing. My sister was killed by a Lannister. My nephews were killed by a Lannister. I came to King's Landing because justice has a way of arriving in its own time if you're patient enough to be present when it does." He looked at her. "I find I have something in common with your brother. We both want things from Lannisters that Lannisters would prefer not to give." Sansa turned and looked at him properly. "You want Cersei. I want the mountain," he said. "Gregor Clegane killed my sister. He acted on Lannister orders." He spread his hands. "The chain is clear." "What does this have to do with me?" "Nothing yet," Oberyn said. "Perhaps nothing ever. But you're a Stark girl in a Lannister cage, and your brother is taking the North apart and putting it back together without asking anyone's permission, and it occurs to me," he stood, smoothed his tunic, "that a Stark in King's Landing, alive and well and married to a Lannister, is a complicated piece on the board. The Lannisters keep you because you're leverage. They can't use you while you're married to Tyrion, but they can't let you go either." He paused. "What would happen, do you think, if that piece were no longer where they left it?" He walked away without waiting for an answer. The guard at the gate watched him leave with the expression of a man who suspected he'd missed something. Sansa sat with her hands in her lap and thought. 3 days after Robert Glover rode east, he rode back. 4 days exactly, as he'd promised, or close enough that Jon wasn't going to nitpick. He came through Winterfell's gates at midday with his 150 riders intact and the Dreadfort's garrison banner rolled up on a pole, trailing in the mud behind his lead horse like a flag surrendered. 2 of his men were bandaged, none were missing. He walked into the great hall and put the banner on the table in front of Jon without ceremony. Jon looked at it, the flayed man on gray. Looked at Glover. "How many?" 41 defenders, Glover said. He was still road dusty, hadn't stopped to change, had clearly decided coming directly to Jon was more important than appearances. 27 surrendered before we got the gate open. 11 more when we got inside. 3 made it, I think, through a postern gate on the eastern side, which is my error. We should have had it covered. 3 men running east, Jon said, toward Bolton's march. "Yes," Glover said. Not apologetic, just factual. He owned the mistake without theater. How long before they reached Bolton's vanguard? Sam was already at the table with his maps. If Bolton is where we think he is, moving up the King's Road, they'd reach his outriders in maybe 3 days riding hard. 2 if they're very motivated. "They're very motivated," Ed said. 2 days then, Jon said, which means Bolton knows about the Dreadfort in 2 days, knows his plan is unraveling in 2 days and starts making decisions. He looked at the room. "Good." Glover raised an eyebrow. "Good. Bolton's been in control of the story until now," Jon said. "He's been marching north to restore order. Now his own castle's been taken, the northern lords have received a letter calling him an oathbreaker, and the man he didn't account for is sitting in Winterfell." Jon picked up the banner, looked at the flayed man, set it back down. "He's going to be angry, and angry men make different decisions than patient ones." "You want him angry," Tormund said. He was sitting at the end of the table eating cheese with his knife, following the conversation with the alert interest of a man at a cockfight. "I want him reactive," Jon said. "There's a difference. Angry men make decisions, reactive men make mistakes." Glover sat down. Someone put a cup in front of him and he drank from it without checking what was in it. "The Dreadfort is ours," he said. "Who holds it?" Jon had thought about this on the walk from the yard. "Huxley," he said. Sir Walton Huxley looked up from the far end of the table. He'd been listening, he was always listening, always a little separate, the complicated loyalty of a man who'd pledged to someone who'd defeated him. "My lord," he said carefully. "You know the castle," Jon said. "You were Bolton's man, you know how it's defended, where the weaknesses are, how the garrison thinks." He held Huxley's gaze. "I'm trusting you with it. 50 men. Hold it and report to me if anything moves." A beat. Huxley was working through something. Jon could see it, the calculation that was also a question about character. What kind of lord gives his former enemy a castle? "Yes, my lord," Huxley said. There was something different in his voice than there'd been before. Jon filed it away and moved on. The Raven from King's Landing arrived on the same day Glover came back, which meant it was a day of news, most of it pointing in the same direction. It was not from Sansa. It was from Varys, which was either reassuring or alarming. Jon hadn't yet decided which. The letter was written in a precise, characterless hand, as if the act of writing it had been performed by someone who intended to be invisible. "Lord Stark, your letter to the Crown was received. The Crown's official position on northern affairs is as yet undetermined. I write in an unofficial capacity to advise you that Lord Bolton's support in King's Landing is less certain than he believes. The Lannisters find him useful as a concept, a compliant northern lord, but useful concepts must remain controllable. A northern war damages trade, burdens supply lines, and creates exactly the kind of uncertainty Lord Tywin spent his career preventing. My advice, worth whatever you decide it's worth, move faster than they expect. The capital will follow success. It always does. A friend. Jon read it twice and then showed it to Sam. Sam read it and said, "Varys." "Yes," Jon said. "How do you know it's genuine and not a trap?" "I don't," Jon said, "but it doesn't tell me anything I didn't know. Move fast. Success generates legitimacy. That's not a secret." He folded the letter. "What it tells me that I didn't know is that someone in King's Landing has decided to hedge, and that someone with Varys' access has decided I'm worth hedging toward. That's actually significant," Sam said. "It's a piece," Jon said. "One piece." Don't let it change the plan. Sam made a note. Jon sometimes wondered if Sam's notes would one day constitute a more accurate history of these events than anything written afterward by people who hadn't been in the room. He suspected they would. Sansa was more careful than anyone gave her credit for. She had been underestimated so consistently for so long that she'd stopped being offended by it and started using it, which was the only sane response. People saw a pretty girl who smiled and said the right thing and cried at the wrong time, and had been shaped by all the wrong forces into something soft and apologetic. They saw that and stopped looking. She spent 2 days after her conversation with Oberyn thinking about what he'd actually said. Not the surface of it, the political meaning, the Dornish angle, but the mechanism he'd suggested. A piece no longer where they left it. He was talking about getting her out. She was talking about getting herself out. There was a difference. She went to she first. She was sharp and loyal in the specific way of someone who'd made a practical decision about which side of a line she stood on, and who had decided, somewhere along the way, that Sansa's side was the side she was on. They had an understanding that had been built in the spaces between words, in the small signals of two women who both knew they were being watched and had learned to communicate in the margins. "If I needed to leave the Red Keep," Sansa said quietly while she dressed her hair, in the way that one doesn't ask permission for "how long would I need?" She met her eyes in the mirror. "Depends on who you need to get past. The Lannister guards at the postern gate," Sansa said. "And whoever watches the river entrance." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a man who brings wine to the kitchens, comes twice a week. His boat is big enough for 6 people. She kept working with Sansa's hair, her movements completely normal. "He's been very helpful to a mutual friend of ours in the past." "How much?" "Not gold," she said. "Information. He likes information." Sansa looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was very still. "When does he next come?" 4 days. "Tell him I'd like to speak with him," Sansa said, informally. She said nothing, just finished the braid with a neat, decisive motion. That night at dinner, Sansa sat beside Tyrion and was gracious and quiet and smiled at the right moments and paid very careful attention to everything around her. Not visibly, not with the alertness that attracted attention, but with the deep listening of someone who had decided that every piece of information was potentially the piece that mattered. She watched Cersei watch Oberyn. She watched Joffrey ignore Margaery in favor of whichever cruelty was currently entertaining him. She watched Tywin Lannister sit at the head of the table like a man who had constructed the world and was mildly dissatisfied with the way it was running. She watched and she listened and she held herself ready, the way you held a bowstring, the tension invisible until the moment of release. Jon was coming. She had to last long enough for it to mean something. The message from Bolton arrived at Winterfell on the 19th day. Not a raven, a rider under a flag of parley, a Bolton man with a sealed letter and the specific expression of someone who had been given a job he didn't entirely want. Jon received him in the yard, not the hall, the yard, because he wanted Bolton's messenger to see the walls and the activity and the number of people drilling in the mud. The letter was everything Jon had expected and nothing he hadn't. Roose Bolton wrote in a measured, precise hand that matched his reputation. There was no anger in it. Jon read it for anger and found none, which was more unnerving than rage would have been. Bolton wrote the way a man played chess, each sentence placed exactly where it needed to be, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. He acknowledged Jon's claim. He did not concede it. He offered to recognize Jon as Lord of Winterfell under the authority of the Crown, pending the Crown's confirmation, provided Jon acknowledged Bolton as Warden of the North, a position, he noted, that the Crown had already confirmed. He expressed sorrow about the events at the Twins, which he described as a tragedy he had done his best to prevent. He made no specific accusation against anyone, including himself, which was perhaps the most sophisticated thing in the letter. He offered terms. Jon read it to the room. The room was quiet for a moment. "He wants you to admit the Crown has authority over your title," Glover said. "If you do that, the Crown decides what I am," Jon said. "Yes." "He's not wrong that they've confirmed his wardenship," Serwyn said, with the discomfort of someone reporting an unwelcome fact. "He's right that they have," Sam said, "for now, but the Crown is..." Jon's letter went south. "Varys is watching. Cersei needs Bolton to be a contained problem, not a war." He was doing something complicated in his head. Jon could see it. If Jon wins, if Jon demonstrably wins, the Crown will recognize whoever holds the North, because the alternative is another war and King's Landing doesn't want another war right now. "So we win," Jon said. "So you win," Sam said, preferably loudly. Jon looked at the letter. Looked at the careful handwriting, the precisely placed sentences, the offer that sounded reasonable and was in fact a trap dressed as a gift. He wrote back in his own hand, which was less precise but more itself. "Lord Bolton, I appreciate the clarity of your letter. My answer is equally clear. I am Lord of Winterfell by my brother's will and my father's blood. I require no crown's confirmation of what is mine by right. The wardenship of the North belongs to the Lord of Winterfell as it has for 300 years, and there is only one Lord of Winterfell. I do not offer terms. I offer you one choice. Account for the Red Wedding before the Northern Lords in open assembly, and accept whatever judgment they render. That is justice. That is the old God's law. Anything else is just delay. If you march on Winterfell, I will meet you, not inside these walls. I'll come out and meet you, which should tell you everything you need to know about how I view our respective positions. Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, he sealed it, gave it to Bolton's rider, and watched the man leave. Tormund appeared at his shoulder. You told him you'd meet him in the field. Yes, Jon said. We have 500 men. 512, Jon said, and more coming. Tormund was quiet for a moment. I like it, he said. I know, Jon said. It's reckless. It's a statement, Jon said. Bolton fights with 3,000 men in caution. I come at him with 500 and no fear. Every man who hears about that chooses a side. And they don't choose the 3,000. They might, Tormund said, if they're sensible. The North has never been sensible, Jon said. That's why I love it. Tormund made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You sound like a free man, he said. It was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. The battle, when it came, did not come at Winterfell. Bolton moved faster than Jon had expected, not the full army. A vanguard, testing, probing, the kind of military caution that spoke of a man who had not survived as long as Roose Bolton by being careless. 300 cavalry moving north of the King's Road, cutting east through the forest toward Winterfell from an angle that was supposed to avoid Jon's scouting. Ghost found them first. The direwolf came back fast, very fast, the tight, anxious return that meant close and moving, and Jon had his company on horseback in 12 minutes, not the full force. 200 riders, the most mobile, the ones who could move through forest without losing cohesion. Tormund's people at the flanks, Serwyn's cavalry in the center. He hit the vanguard in a forest clearing 3 miles northeast of Winterfell. He hit them from 3 sides. The Bolton cavalry were good. They were veterans, properly equipped, moving in formation, and their commander was competent. Jon could tell from the way they tried to form a defensive square the moment the attack came, which was the right response. It almost worked, almost. Because the problem with fighting in a forest clearing against people who had grown up in forests was that trees were not neutral terrain. Tormund's fighters moved through the tree line like they were part of it, hitting flanks from positions no cavalry formation could account for, and Ghost was in the middle of it. Ghost, who was the size of a small horse, and who had chosen in that moment to be exactly as terrifying as he actually was, white and red-eyed and moving through armored men like wind through tall grass. Jon fought from horseback with Longclaw, and it was nothing like the controlled sparring of the yard. It was fast and loud and brutal, the kind of fighting where you made decisions before you'd finished the thought, where you trusted your body to be ahead of your mind. He was everywhere the fight needed him to be. Not recklessly, he knew exactly where he was, exactly where the threat was, exactly where a gap needed closing. He wasn't afraid of any of them, that was the thing. He'd been afraid at the fist of the first men, properly afraid, existentially afraid, the way you were afraid of things that didn't die properly. These were men he could fight, men he could beat. The fear he'd carried as a bastard boy trying to prove his worth had burned off somewhere on the road south, and what was left was just ability, clean and cold and certain. The Bolton commander tried to rally his men. Jon rode at him personally, and their exchange lasted about 45 seconds, and at the end of it the commander was on the ground with a dislocated shoulder and his sword was in Jon's hand. The vanguard broke, some ran, most surrendered. Jon sat on his horse in the clearing while the last of it resolved and looked at the ground and then at Tormund. 63, Tormund said. Maybe 11 got away. 11 riders back to Bolton, with news. Good, Jon said. Tormund stared at him. I keep saying you fight like a free man, and you keep making me mean it more. Are any of ours badly hurt? Jon said. 2 broken arms. One man's going to have trouble hearing from one ear. Get them back to Winterfell. Jon sheathed Longclaw. The blade caught the winter light in the clearing, that deep dark shimmer. And someone find me their commander. I want to talk to him before he loses consciousness. The commander's name was Sir Harry's Brune. He was 40, experienced, with the flat professional demeanor of a career soldier who had served enough lords to have opinions about most of them. He sat against a tree with his arm in a rough sling that Illa had made, which held the shoulder reasonably still and hurt badly enough that Brune was slightly pale, and looked at Jon with eyes that were calculating even through the pain. "You're the bastard," Brune said. Not insulting, observational, same tone he'd used to say you're the one in the black cloak. Stark, Jon said. He was so used to saying it now that it came out before he'd finished hearing the word. Brune almost smiled. You fight like that without armor. Jon looked down at himself. Leather and a mail shirt, no plate. He hadn't had time for plate and hadn't particularly wanted it. Armor slows you down. So does a sword in the chest, Brune said. Hence the moving fast, Jon said. He crouched down in front of him. How many men is Bolton bringing? Brune said nothing. I know about the 3,000, Jon said, give or take. I'm not asking for a number I don't have, I'm asking about composition. Cavalry to infantry ratio, siege equipment. He paused. I'll let you go back to your lord either way. This conversation doesn't change that. Brune studied him. Why let me go? Because every man who goes back to Bolton's camp tells a story, Jon said, and I'd like some control over what story gets told. Something moved in Brune's face, the respect of a professional recognizing another professional's thinking. He was quiet for a moment, and Jon could see him making a calculation. What was the cost of this? What were the odds? Did loyalty to Roose Bolton actually demand here in a forest clearing sitting against a tree with a dislocated shoulder? 2,400 infantry, Brune said without inflection. 600 cavalry, no siege engines. He left them at the Twins. He didn't think he'd need them. A pause. He thought you'd be easier. Jon stood up. Tell him, he said, that Jon Stark sends his regards, and that the Dreadfort sends its regards, and that the Northern Lords send their regards. He looked down at Brune. Tell him the North is not his. Brune looked up at him. In his expression was something that was not quite defeat and not quite conversion, more like the moment when a man updated his assessment of a situation and found that the update was significant. Yes, my lord, Brune said. It was the first time anyone Jon hadn't asked had used that title unprompted. He heard it land and let it pass without marking it, because marking it would have felt like the wrong kind of pride, the soft kind that got you killed. He walked back to his horse. Around him the clearing was being organized, prisoners, wounded horses. The forest was cold and smelled of pine and blood. Jon, Sam said. Sam was somehow always there after battles, appearing from wherever sensible people positioned themselves during the fighting with his notes already open. Bolton will reach Winterfell in 3 days if he pushes. He'll push, Jon said. Brune's report will make him angry. You wanted him angry. I wanted him reactive, Jon said. There's a difference, yes, you said, Sam finished. He looked at his notes. 2 more ravens came while you were gone. Flint's fingers sending men 40, maybe 50, and there's a raven from Jon. Something in his voice changed. Jon looked at him. There's a raven from Sansa, Sam said. Jon was very still. Let me see it. Sam handed it over. The handwriting was Sansa's. He knew it from letters she'd written years ago, before everything, from the careful loops of her S and the slight formality of the script that she'd been taught was correct. It was very short. The wine merchant comes in 2 days. I'll be with him. Get word to the Eyrie. Littlefinger has a hold over me I need broken, and I think you have leverage he doesn't know about. I'm coming north. Don't tell me to wait. Jon read it and felt something release in his chest that had been clenched for a long time. She's getting out, Sam said. She's already out, Jon said, looking at the letter. This was written 2 days ago. He looked north-south in the direction of the road to King's Landing. She's on the water. Littlefinger is a problem, Sam said. Littlefinger is a later problem, Jon said. First Bolton. Right, Sam said. Yes, Bolton first. Jon mounted up. Around him his riders were forming, heading back through the trees toward Winterfell. Ghost fell in beside the horse, massive and quiet, the red eyes sweeping the tree line with the calm certainty of something that had no doubts about what it was. Jon rode north toward Winterfell, toward Bolton's coming army, toward the thing that had been building since the night Maester Aemon put a letter in his hand and said, "Sit down." He was not afraid. He was, if anything, impatient. Chapter 5, Ghost and Sword. She came off the boat at White Harbor smelling like fish and salt, and 3 weeks of a river barge followed by a coastal vessel that had made its living somewhere between legitimate trading and things that weren't quite legal, with the particular look of a woman who had slept badly on moving water and was absolutely not going to mention it. Sansa Stark walked down the gangplank at White Harbor in a wool cloak 2 sizes too large for her, with she 3 steps behind and a hood pulled low against the cold, and stood for a moment on the dock while the world stopped moving beneath her feet in the way it took some time to stop after you'd been at sea. She breathed northern air, cold, clean. Pine somewhere in it and salt, and the particular quality of north air that she hadn't breathed in 2 years, and that she'd convinced herself she'd forgotten and hadn't. She was home. Not Winterfell. Winterfell was still miles and miles north, and between her and it there were complications she'd mapped on the ship in the quiet hours when she was sleeping. But she was in the north. She was standing on northern ground, breathing northern air, and no Lannister was watching her do it. She let herself have exactly 30 seconds of that. Then she went to find a horse. Lord Wyman Manderley received her in his great hall at Newcastle, which was not new. The name was relative, applied some centuries ago when the previous castle had burned, and the Manderleys had built a replacement with the characteristic northern practicality of people who did not waste time being sentimental about ruins when there was shelter to be constructed. Manderley himself was large, famously large. The kind of large that people who hadn't met him found difficult to picture accurately, and people who had met him found difficult to forget. He was sitting behind a table that was itself large, eating from a plate that was proportionate, and he looked at Sansa when she was shown in with the specific expression of a man who was very good at seeming uncomplicated. He was not uncomplicated. Sansa had done her research on the ship. The Manderleys had lost a son, Wendell, killed at the Red Wedding. They had another son prisoner in Lannister hands. Wyman Manderley smiled and feasted and appeared to cooperate with whatever power was closest, which was currently Lannister power, and had been observed to weep at his son's funeral, and had been observed to do nothing public in response to the Red Wedding. She knew what that meant, understood it from the inside. Lady Sansa, Manderley said. His voice was very warm. What a complete surprise. Lord Manderley, she said, I need horses and an escort north, and I need you to not mention to anyone that I was here. Manderley looked at her for a long moment, then he smiled, and this smile was different from the public one, smaller, less performance, more actual. Jon Stark's sister, he said, riding north. Yes, Jon Stark who holds Winterfell, he said. Jon Stark who sent letters to every northern lord calling Bolton an oathbreaker. He picked up his cup. Jon Stark who destroyed a Bolton vanguard in the Wolfswood last week. He paused. Word travels fast in the north when people want it to. Sansa sat down across from him without being invited because she had stopped waiting for invitations. Lord Manderley, whose side are you on? The directness of it seemed to please him. He set down his cup and folded his large hands on the table, and the performance dropped entirely, like a man taking off a coat he'd been wearing all day. The Norths, he said. I have always been on the North side. He paused. I have a grandson in Lannister hands. I have been performing cooperation because I had no one to rally to until very recently. He looked at her steadily. I have been waiting, Lady Sansa, very patiently, for exactly this. Sansa held his gaze. How many men? Enough to matter, he said, if the time is right. The time, Sansa said, is right. He studied her for another moment. Then he stood, a lengthy process given the architecture, and said, I'll have horses ready by morning, and I'll send 400 men north with you because Jon Stark is going to need everything the north has, and the Manderleys do not forget what they owe a Stark. He held out his hand. She shook it, which was not a very ladylike thing to do, and was the correct thing to do. One more thing, she said. Petter Baelish, Littlefinger, he's at the Eyrie. He has leverage over things I need to have leverage over first. I need to know if Jon has reached out. I received a raven from Winterfell yesterday, Manderley said, addressed to me and apparently sent to everyone of consequence on the eastern coast. He reached behind him to a table cluttered with correspondence and produced a folded parchment. There is a postscript specifically for you. She took it. The postscript was 4 lines in Jon's hand. Littlefinger's leverage is whatever he knows or thinks he knows. His power is information and the belief that he's the only one who has it. Take that away and he has nothing. Tell him I know about the Eyrie. Tell him I know about Lysa. Tell him he can cooperate, or I can tell the Vale everything I know and let the Vale lords decide what to do with him. He will cooperate. Sansa read it twice. Then she folded it neatly into her sleeve. Jon didn't know everything Littlefinger had done, not specifically, not the details, but he knew enough to threaten. And Littlefinger, who operated on the principle that information was power, would understand immediately that someone had information on him. The specifics almost didn't matter. The threat of specifics was enough. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly. Hope had been the thing that kept getting her into trouble, the naive version, the version that believed things would just work out. This was something more grounded than that, more useful. She felt capable. Thank you, Lord Manderley, she said. Don't lose, he said simply. Jon was counting men. He did it every morning, not because the number had stopped changing. It was still changing. Riders coming in every 2 or 3 days from holds that had received the letter and decided, but because the count was the clearest measure he had of where he stood. 512 after Glover's return. 630 after the Flint and Hornwood men arrived. 709 when the Mormont soldiers came down from the ship at White Harbor and marched north. Standing in the yard watching the morning drill on the 21st day, Jon counted 843. Not 3,000, but not nothing. Tormund came up beside him with a heel of bread in his fist and stood eating it with the focused appreciation of a man who had spent enough time being hungry to find food genuinely interesting. He looked at the drilling men, Night's Watch black, Free Folk leather, Northern wool and iron, all moving through the same exercises with varying degrees of enthusiasm. They're better than they were, Tormund said. They need to be better still, Jon said. In 3 days, too, Jon said. Bolton will be here in 2 days. Tormund ate the bread. You're going to tell me the plan today. I've told you the plan. You've told me pieces. You tell Sam pieces. You tell Serwyn pieces. You tell me different pieces. Tormund looked at him with the specific expression of a man who was amused by this but was also done with it. I'm going to put the pieces together and tell you what I think you're planning, and you tell me if I'm wrong. Jon said nothing, which was permission. You're not fighting a battle, Tormund said. You're fighting a moment. You don't need to beat 3,000 men. You need to beat them badly enough and publicly enough and fast enough that the lords who are watching decide the outcome is clear. He paused. You hit him hard in the first hour. You make it expensive immediately. You make it look like you're stronger than you are. He finished the bread. And you've got something else, something I haven't seen yet. Jon looked at him. Ghost, Tormund said. You're going to use Ghost in a way you haven't told anyone about. Jon said nothing for a moment. Then Bolton's cavalry horses have never seen a direwolf. Tormund's grin spread slowly. They'll lose their minds, he said. Every horse that breaks formation is a rider who's no longer a rider, Jon said. Hit the cavalry first with Ghost, follow it with your people from the flank, and Bolton's numerical advantage is reduced before the infantry ever engages. And you, Tormund said, where are you in this? Front, Jon said. Tormund studied him. You know that if you die this ends. I know, Jon said. That's why I'm not going to die. Excellent strategy, Tormund said very dryly. I have Longclaw and 800 fighters and a direwolf the size of a horse, Jon said, and I am fighting for my home. Bolton has numbers and cleverness. He looked at Tormund steadily. I'll take my odds. Tormund nodded once. Something in his face was, not worried, not exactly, but close. The specific concern of someone who had decided to follow a man and then realized that the man was fully, completely, unambiguously unafraid, which was both the most inspiring and most alarming thing a leader could be. Fine, Tormund said. Then we go forward. We go forward, Jon agreed. Stannis Baratheon arrived at the wall on the 22nd day. Jon knew about it before the Raven arrived, because word on the Kingsroad moved faster than ravens when riders were motivated, and the news was large enough. A raven from Castle Black, 3 sentences in Maester Aemon's hand. Stannis Baratheon is at the wall with 9,000 men and a Red Priestess. He is asking for the Lord Commander. I told him the Lord Commander rode south. He is asking for you. Jon read it at the table where he'd been reviewing supply counts with Sam, and then read it again because 9,000 was a number that required processing. Stannis, Sam said, reading over his shoulder. He said it in the tone of a man who'd read enough history to have opinions. Stannis brought an army to the wall. He needed somewhere to go, Jon said. The south is Lannister. The wall is, he thought about it. The wall is technically crown property, which means Stannis, as claimant to the crown, can argue it belongs to him. Does it? Everything belongs to someone right now, Jon said. That's the problem. He set the Raven down. He's going to march south. He has 9,000 men, Sam said, and no one north of the neck to fight, Jon said. He didn't come north just to hold the wall. He came north because he needs a win, and the north has a war he can participate in. He stood. Send a Raven back. Tell Stannis I'd welcome a meeting. Tell him I'm preparing for an engagement with Bolton's forces in approximately 2 days, and if he wants to discuss the future of the North, he should arrive before then. Sam wrote it down. What are you going to offer him? Something he wants, Jon said, which is legitimacy from the North, Jon said. Lords who will call him king, the Watch's support for his claim. He paused. And I want something in return, which is 9,000 men, Jon said. Sam stopped writing. Jon. If Stannis comes and helps you beat Bolton, and then you're dependent on Stannis. I said I want 9,000 men for the battle, Jon said. Not forever. Stannis' army fights Bolton. After Bolton is dealt with, we have a conversation about what comes next. Man to man, lord to king, or lord to claimant, we'll see. He looked at Sam. I'm not giving the North to Stannis. I'm asking Stannis to help me save it. There's a difference, Sam said. Yes, Jon said, and he'll know it. Stannis is many things. He's not stupid. He moved to the window looking at the yard. He'll come. He needs this as much as I need him. Mutually beneficial, Sam said. Everything worth doing is, Jon said. Arya Stark had been walking north for 11 days. Before that she'd been on a ship for 3 weeks, and before that she'd been in Bravos for months, learning things in a house that smelled of the sea and silence, learning to be no one, learning to move like water and think like stone. And she'd been good at it, genuinely good, better than the other students, which had made Jake and H. Carr look at her with that expression that was half approval and half warning, the look of someone watching a fire grow bigger than the grate. She had not stayed. She'd gotten a Raven. Not sent to her, sent to the House of Black and White, addressed to a girl named Arya Stark, which was not the name she was supposed to have anymore, which was the point. Someone had known where to send it and sent it there, which meant someone knew things they weren't supposed to know. The raven had said, Winterfell, Jon, come home, 3 words, no signature. In a hand she recognized from years of letters from a brother she hadn't seen since she was 10 years old. She'd left the next day. Jaqen had watched her go and hadn't stopped her, which she'd spent 3 days of walking thinking about. Either he was letting her leave because she hadn't yet become no one enough to stay, or he was letting her leave because what she was going to do next was something only Arya Stark could do, and he had decided that was more interesting than keeping her. She hadn't decided which. She decided it didn't matter. She moved fast. She'd always been fast. Syrio had made her faster. The months at the House of Black and White had made her something past fast. She moved through landscape the way she moved through crowds, present and invisible simultaneously, taking up exactly as much space as was useful and no more. She ate what the land provided, which in the north in winter was limited but sufficient if you knew what you were looking for, and she knew what she was looking for. She slept when she needed to and moved when she could. She crossed the neck on the 11th day, the long causeway through the swamp, and the air changed, became colder, drier, more itself, and something in her chest that had been clenched since she left Braavos, and before that since King's Landing, and before that since the day her father died loosened a single notch. She was in the north. A man was following her. She'd noticed him 2 days before the neck, not obviously, not sloppily, the kind of following that would fool most people. He stayed a quarter mile back, varied his pace, used the tree line where available. He was good. She was better. She stopped in a clearing south of the burned village that used to be called Stony Shore, sat against a tree, ate a piece of dried fish, and waited. He came into the clearing 9 minutes later, moving carefully, and found her sitting there looking at him. He stopped. He was young, maybe 20, northern by his cloak, with a horse he'd been leading because a horse following at a quarter mile was more obvious than a person. His face had the look of someone who'd been given a job and was now reassessing how the job was going. You've been following me for 2 days, Arya said. You're not bad at it. You're Arya Stark, the man said. Maybe, she said. I was sent by Lord Stark. He reached slowly into his cloak. I can show you. You don't need to show me anything, Arya said. Jon sent you. Yes, my lady. She looked at him. He was nervous. Not dangerously nervous, just the regular kind, standing in a clearing with a girl who'd spotted him before he'd spotted her and who was sitting very still in the way that some people found more unsettling than activity. What's your name? She said. Edric, my lady. Edric Nori. From the mountain clans went to Winterfell. Some of us, he said, when Lord Stark called. She stood up, brushed dried fish crumbs from her tunic. She was still small. She'd always been going to be small. She made peace with it. Small was useful, but something about the way she moved made Edric take a half step back without visibly deciding to. How far is Winterfell? She said. 4 days on horse, he said. 2.5 if we push. We push, Arya said. Get on your horse. He got on his horse. She walked to it and vaulted up behind him with the ease of someone who'd been getting on and off horses under less comfortable circumstances for years, and he started forward, and she looked at the trees going past and thought about Jon's face, trying to remember it clearly after all this time. The jaw, the gray, stark eyes, the serious expression that broke into something completely different when he laughed, which he didn't do enough. She was going to see Jon. Everything else could wait. Stannis Baratheon arrived at Winterfell's gates on the afternoon of the 23rd day, 2 days before Bolton, which was exactly what Jon had asked for and which Jon found he respected Stannis for. The man did what he said he would do on time, without theater. He came through the gates on a gray horse, lean and straight-backed, with the expression of a man who ground his teeth in his sleep, and had decided the rest of the world should apologize for it. Behind him rode his officers and the Red Woman, Melisandre, the priestess of Arlor, who was striking and composed, and who looked at Jon when she entered the yard with eyes that were doing something Jon didn't entirely like, some calculation, some recognition that had no basis in any prior meeting. Jon met Stannis in the yard. The king, claimant king, Jon was going to have to figure out how to navigate that, dismounted and looked at Jon with iron-gray eyes that were measuring him in a way that was professional rather than hostile. He was perhaps 40, with a jaw set like a fortification and the general air of someone who had been right about everything for 20 years and had found this more exhausting than satisfying. Jon Stark, Stannis said, not a greeting, an identification. Your Grace, Jon said. The acknowledgement of the title was deliberate. He'd thought about it. Stannis had a claim. It was not necessarily Jon's to adjudicate right now, and acknowledging it cost him nothing in the short term. Something flickered in Stannis' eyes. Unexpected, that title. He'd expected to have to argue for it. Your castle is in poor repair, Stannis said. I've had other priorities, Jon said. Come inside. We should talk before Bolton arrives. Stannis looked around the yard, the mixed forces, the free folk, ghosts sitting at the edge of the yard looking at Stannis' horses with the relaxed interest of something that could very easily be not relaxed, and said nothing, which was Stannis' version of impressed. They sat in the great hall, just the two of them and Sam and Stannis' Maester, Davos Seaworth sitting to Stannis' right with the quiet attention of a man who'd learned that the most useful thing at a table was to listen before he spoke. Jon had thought about how to approach this conversation. He'd thought about it for 2 days. He'd decided the only approach was the honest one. You need the north, Jon said. The Lannisters have the south. You have 9,000 men in a cause and no base of operations below the wall. If you take Bolton's army apart with me, the northern lords will respect you. Some of them will call you king. That's what you need. Stannis looked at him. And what do you need? Your 9,000 men for this battle, Jon said. After that, we negotiate your claim against my needs for the north. You don't bend the knee, Stannis said. It was not quite an accusation, more an observation he was checking the accuracy of. Not yet, Jon said, because the North's loyalty has to mean something to the person who receives it. If I give it to you before you've earned it, it means nothing, and you'll find out what it means when the lords you need stop being useful to you. He held Stannis' gaze. Win this battle, show the North what you are. After that, I'll kneel or I won't, and either way it'll be an honest answer. The silence that followed was long. Davos, to Stannis' right, had stopped moving completely. Stannis looked at Jon with those grinding, iron-gray eyes, and Jon looked back, and neither of them looked away, and this was not a staring contest. It was something more functional, two men who operated on principle meeting each other, and working out if the principles were compatible. You're Ned Stark's son, Stannis said at last. Yes, Jon said. He was the most honest man I ever met, Stannis said. Annoying in many ways, but honest. Yes, Jon said. Another pause. My army joins yours for the engagement, Stannis said, after we discussed terms. He held out his hand across the table. Jon took it. The grip was hard and brief. Now, Stannis said, show me your dispositions. I want to know what we're doing before dawn. She arrived the next morning. Jon was at the table reviewing maps with Stannis and Tormund and Glover when Gren appeared at the door with his mouth slightly open and the expression of someone who needed to say something but had found that the thing he needed to say had temporarily made him forget how words worked. Jon, Gren said. Jon looked up. There's someone, Gren said. He stopped, started again. There's Jon, come to the gate. Jon read Gren's face and stood up. He walked out of the hall and through the yard into the gate, and she was standing inside it off a horse with a northern cloak and Bravosi boots and a face that was Arya's face, older, sharper, with things in it that hadn't been there when she was 10 years old and arguing about sword forms in the Winterfell yard, and the same eyes, the same gray Stark eyes, absolutely unchanged. They stood there for a moment. You got fat, Arya said. I didn't, Jon said. Slightly, she said. He crossed the yard in 5 steps and she met him halfway and he picked her up without deciding to, lifted her off the ground the way he had when she was small, and she didn't protest, which meant it was allowed, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. He held his sister and she held him and the yard was quiet around them, men finding reasons to look elsewhere, the particular discretion of soldiers who understood the difference between privacy and secrecy. When he put her down, her eyes were dry. His were not quite, which he suspected she noticed and chose not to mention, which was its own kind of gift. How, he said, ship to White Harbor, rider north. She paused. You sent the rider. I sent riders to a lot of places, Jon said. I didn't know if you were in Bravos. I was, she said. I left. He looked at her. At the way she stood, balanced, ready, present in a way that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with habit. Something had happened to her in the world that had made her into something he didn't entirely recognize yet but knew was formidable. Are you all right? He said. She thought about it, which he appreciated. She didn't give him the easy answer. I'm better, she said. I'm here. She looked around the yard at the size of the force assembled, at Tormund's people and the Watch's black and the Northern Lord's colors. Her eyes found Ghost and something shifted in her face. She walked over to the direwolf and put her hand out and Ghost pressed his enormous head into it with the certainty of an animal that remembered. He got big, she said. Yes, Jon said. She looked back at him. There's a battle tomorrow. Yes. Good, she said, with a directness that he found both completely familiar and slightly alarming. I've been traveling for 3 weeks and I'm very tired of not fighting anything. You're not fighting in the battle, Jon said. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was so specifically Arya, the particular combination of disbelief and preemptive rejection, that he had to fight something that wanted to be a smile. "Jon," she said. "Arya," he said. "If you tell me to stay in the castle, I'm telling you to stay in the castle," he said. "For this one," he held her gaze. "You've been walking for weeks, you're tired, and I cannot fight tomorrow with one eye on where you are. Give me tomorrow. After tomorrow you can fight whatever you want." She studied him. He could see her working through the argument, finding its logic, deciding if it was genuine or just protective instinct dressed as strategy. "After tomorrow," she said. "After tomorrow," he said. A pause. "Fine," she said with the tone of someone filing this away as a debt to be collected. "Show me where I'm sleeping, and I need food. The North has terrible foraging in winter, which seems like an oversight." He took her inside. The night before the battle, Jon walked the walls alone. Not because he needed to check the defenses. He'd checked them 3 times already, knew every post, had put the right people in the right places with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the difference between winning and losing was often the detail everyone else thought was too small to matter. He walked the walls because he needed the air and the dark and the quiet, the space to do the thing he didn't let himself do in rooms full of people who were watching his face for information about whether they should be afraid. He was not afraid of dying tomorrow. He looked at that possibility squarely, and it did not move him the way he thought it might. What he was, something adjacent to afraid, something colder and more specific, was afraid of not being enough, of Robb's letter meaning nothing. Of the North losing again, the Starks losing again, everything losing again in the way it had been losing, since his father put his head down on a block in King's Landing, and the world came apart. He stood on the wall and looked north and south and at the stars. He thought about his father. About the man who had ridden south once and come back with a bastard son and a story he never told and a grief he never named. About the man who had told Jon once, the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, and had meant it as a lesson about responsibility, but which Jon had come to understand as something larger, the idea that you owned your choices, lived inside them, wore them, didn't get to be separate from what you decided. He'd decided to come south. He'd decided to take Winterfell. He decided to call the banners and write the letters and make the promises and send Sam to the Umbers and take the Dreadfort and meet Bolton's vanguard in the forest. Every one of those decisions was his. He owned them. Tomorrow was his too. Ghost appeared at the top of the stairs, climbing the steps with a silence that always slightly amazed Jon given his size, and padded to his side. Jon put his hand on the great wolf's head. "Tomorrow," he said. Ghost looked out at the dark south, toward where Bolton's campfires were visible as a smear of orange light against the tree line. 3 miles away, more fires than Jon had stars to count them by. The wolf looked at those fires without any visible concern. Jon looked at them the same way. "We go forward," he said quietly. The wind came from the north, cold and certain, the only direction it ever really came from. He stood there for a long time with his hand on his wolf's head and the fires in the south and the dark in the north, and when he finally went back down the stairs to sleep, he moved like a man who had finished the last thing that needed finishing before the work began. Dawn came gray and cold. He was up before it, dressed and armed by the time the first pale light was suggesting itself over the eastern hills, and he walked out into the yard where his army was already assembling, 800 of his own, and beyond the walls, Stannis' 9,000 spreading across the southern approach in the battle lines they'd planned the night before over maps and arguments and the specific tension of 2 commanders who thought differently enough to argue productively. Tormund found him in the yard. "Ready," he said. "Yes," Jon said. Tormund looked at him for a moment. The big man had been in 100 battles, probably more, the kind of history that was written in old scars and a certain calm that came from having been afraid often enough that it had stopped being the first response. He looked at Jon, and something in his expression it was pride, Jon realized, simple, uncomplicated, enormous. "The North," Tormund said, "is going to remember today." "Good," Jon said, and swung up onto his horse. Ghost was already moving south toward the field, white and enormous and silent, the thing that Bolton's cavalry had never seen, the thing that their horses had never smelled, moving through the cold morning toward the largest army Jon had ever intended to fight. Jon followed his wolf into the day. Chapter 6, King in the North, the field south of Winterfell had no name. That was the thing Jon thought about in the last minutes before it started, standing on horseback at the head of his line, Longclaw drawn, the winter morning gray and cold around him, Bolton's army a dark mass 300 yards south, banners moving in the wind. The field had no name because nothing had ever happened here worth naming. Farmland once, brown and frozen now, crossed by a low ridge that ran east to west and gave whoever held it a slight elevation advantage. Jon held the ridge. He'd taken it in the dark, moving his line up quietly while Bolton's camp was still stirring, and when the sun came up, Bolton's commanders would have looked at the northern line on the ridge and understood what it meant and had the conversation about whether to wait or advance, and Jon was counting on them advancing because Bolton was angry and had 3,000 men, and waiting felt like weakness when you had 3,000 men. They advanced. Jon watched them come, stood very still on his horse, and watched the front line of Bolton infantry begin to move, disciplined, professional, shields up, pikes leveled, the long dark line of them moving across the frozen field like a tide coming in. Cavalry on both flanks, maybe 500 riders on the left side, 400 on the right. He looked left, where Tormund's people were in the trees, invisible. He looked right, where the eastern wing of Stannis' cavalry waited, 900 riders under a Lord Jon didn't know but whom Stannis had vouched for with the specific economy of a man who didn't waste words on vouching. He looked south, where the rest of Stannis' army, 8,000 infantry in formations that had the quality of professional soldiers who'd been doing this for years, were arrayed in 3 deep lines, back far enough that Bolton's scouts might not have counted them clearly in the pre-dawn dark. Bolton had counted 800 men on the ridge. He was seeing 800 men on the ridge. There were 9,800. Jon turned to Gren, who was beside him on a bay horse with his sword out and his jaw set, and the expression he'd always had before a fight, not quite afraid, not quite ready, right in the gap between the two that most people lived in before violence started. "Signal Stannis," Jon said. "Tell him Bolton's moving." Gren lifted the horn and blew at once 2 short notes, the agreed signal. The sound of it went across the field, and the morning air held it and then let it go. Jon looked at Ghost. The direwolf was 20 yards in front of the line, sitting, watching Bolton's cavalry on the left flank with the patient attention of something that had already decided what it was going to do and was waiting for the moment. Jon whistled, low and short. The note they'd worked out over 3 days of practice, not a command exactly, more a release. "Now go, you know what to do." Ghost moved. The horses on Bolton's left flank heard or smelled him first. Jon couldn't tell which from the ridge, but the result was the same. A white shape the size of a pony, moving at full speed, silent, red-eyed, coming out of the morning light with no sound at all, and horses that had never smelled direwolf in their lives reacted with the deep animal panic that no amount of training could fully override. The left flank broke. Not all of it, not instantly. Some riders held their mounts through sheer force of horsemanship, and those were the good ones, the ones who'd grown up with difficult horses. But enough broke. Maybe a third of the 500, horses rearing and spinning and refusing, riders fighting their own animals instead of the enemy. And into that chaos Tormund's people came out of the tree line on the eastern side like water through a crack in a dam, fast and screaming and absolutely committed, the free folk fighting cry going up over the field in a way that did nothing to help the already panicking horses. Bolton's left collapsed inward. Jon didn't watch it happen. He was already moving. He took the ridge at a gallop, down the slope toward the advancing infantry, his 800 following, not a charge exactly, more a controlled descent, hitting the front line of Bolton's pike formation while the left flank was still resolving its chaos. He went in at the junction between 2 sections, the gap between companies that every infantry formation had, and tried to close quickly, and Longclaw was already moving before his horse reached them. The next 20 minutes were the closest thing to controlled madness that Jon had ever experienced. He'd been in fights, he'd been in battles, technically, the skirmish at the Vanguard, the taking of Winterfell, but this was different. This was 800 people against 3,000 in a close-pressed field engagement, and the difference between those numbers was supposed to matter enormously, and it did matter, and he needed it to matter less than it naturally would for long enough that Stannis' army could get across the field and into Bolton's flanks. He needed 12 minutes. He told himself 12 minutes. He needed to hold it and make noise and be everywhere at once and make 3,000 men feel like they were fighting more than 800, and the way you did that was not to stop moving. He did not stop moving. He was at the front, then the flank, then back to the front, Longclaw carving through the cold air, through armor, through the noise and press of it. He fought without fear, which was the simple truth of it, and men who were fighting someone without fear felt it, and it changed something in the calculus of the fight. Men who were afraid of dying fought harder in self-preservation. Men who felt the person they were fighting was simply beyond killing fought differently, fought with doubt already in the motion, already stepping back before the blade arrived. He unhorsed 2 Bolton captains. He held a gap in his own line for about 40 seconds by himself while the men around him regrouped, which was 40 seconds of something he never quite described to anyone afterward because there weren't quite the right words for it. He heard the horn from the south, 2 long notes, Stannis. He pulled his horse back 1 step, just one enough to look south, and saw it, the 8,000, moving. The full weight of Stannis' army coming across the field in two massive lines, the left aimed at Bolton's right flank, the right driving for the rear, a movement that had been planned over maps the night before with the geometric precision that was Stannis' specific gift, the ability to see a battle as a diagram and execute the diagram exactly. Bolton's commanders saw it too. He could tell because the noise changed, the character of the shouting shifted from offensive to uncertain, the specific register of an army that has just realized the shape of what's happening to it. Jon pressed forward. Roose Bolton watched from his command position on a low rise south of the field, and he watched with the stillness of a man whose face had always been a mask, and who had learned over decades that the mask was more useful the more it cost to maintain. He had been betrayed by arithmetic. He understood it clearly and immediately, the moment Stannis' banners appeared, the moment the 9,000 resolved out of the distance. He knew what had happened, and he knew what it meant. He had planned for Jon Stark with 800 men. He had planned for Jon Stark possibly acquiring Northern Lords' levies, had factored in a force of perhaps 1,500, 2,000 at an outside estimate. He had not planned for Stannis Baratheon. No one had planned for Stannis Baratheon. The man arrived in problems the way a sharp cold arrived in autumn, inconvenient, poorly timed, and immediately structural. Bolton looked at the field. His left flank was gone. His center was under pressure from a force that was fighting with a commitment that numbers didn't explain. His right flank was about to be hit by 900 cavalry. He was a practical man. He sent a rider to his own cavalry commander. Hold the right, form defensive, do not advance. Then he turned to his personal guard, 10 men his best, and said very quietly, "We are going to ride north, toward Winterfell, not retreat." Not yet, something more specific. The castle, Winterfell's walls were still there. If he could reach the castle before the battle fully resolved, he had leverage. He had a defensible position. He had a negotiation. He was still thinking about this as a game that could be managed. That was the thing about Roose Bolton. He had been managing situations for so long that he had come to believe all situations were manageable. He was a man who had never quite accepted that some things were past management. He rode north with his 10 guards. Jon was fighting his way back toward his horse. He'd lost it somewhere in the press. It had bolted, and he was on foot in the middle of a battle that was resolving in his favor but was still very much a battle when Arya appeared. She was not supposed to be here. He heard her before he saw her, a shout from the left, high and sharp, and then he caught her in his peripheral vision, moving through the edge of the fight with the specific economy of someone who had been trained for exactly this and trained well. She was not fighting in the mass of it. She was moving at the margins, and everywhere she moved, things stopped being threats. Jon felt a specific exasperation that he could not act on right now and filed it under later. He found a riderless Bolton horse, grabbed the bridle, got up, and started working back toward the center. Gren materialized beside him, also mounted, his face blood-streaked and his sword arm moving with the automatic quality of a man who'd stopped thinking and was operating on muscle memory. "Bolton's center is breaking," Gren shouted over the noise. "Left flank is gone. Stannis has the right." "Where is Bolton?" Jon shouted back. Gren pointed north. Jon looked north, and there, moving away from the battle, up the road toward Winterfell, a small group of riders moving fast. He saw the gray standard of House Bolton, the flayed man moving away from the field where his army was dissolving. Jon turned his horse north and rode. He caught them a mile from the castle. Not because his horse was faster, it wasn't, or only marginally, but because one of Bolton's guards' horses threw a shoe on the frozen road, and the whole column slowed to accommodate it, and Jon had been riding with the certainty of a man who has decided on a destination, and so had not slowed for anything. Bolton heard the hooves and turned in his saddle, and Jon saw his face for the first time at close range, pale, composed, with those pale eyes that had always been described as colorless, and which were in fact colorless, gray so pale it was almost white, looking at Jon with an expression that was recalculating and arriving each time at the same unwelcome result. Jon rode straight at them. The 10 guards spread to intercept. Jon went through the first 2 on the left before they were fully positioned, Longclaw moving fast, exactly as it had been trained to move for 20 years, targeting the gaps in armor, the points between plate and mail, the specific knowledgeable violence of a man who had studied bodies in armor and knew exactly where they were vulnerable. A third guard came from the right, and Jon leaned into it and let the man's horse come in close and hit him with the pommel across the jaw, and the man went sideways off his horse. The other 7 pulled up. There was a moment, one of those instants that existed in battles, a full second or two where the violence paused, where everyone took stock of what had just happened and decided what happened next. Jon pointed Longclaw at Roose Bolton. Bolton was still on his horse. His face was exactly as it had been, composed, recalculating, not afraid in any ordinary way because fear required a certain belief that outcomes were outside your control, and Bolton had spent his life believing he controlled outcomes. "My lord," Jon said. His voice was very level, not angry, just present. "Lord Stark," Bolton said. His voice was what Jon had always heard it described as, quiet, precise, with none of the natural human variation of a man who was currently watching his army dissolve behind him. "You've had a remarkable few weeks. Surrender to me," Jon said, "in front of your guards on the road north of the field. This is the accounting I offered you." "And if I don't?" Jon said nothing. He let the silence do the work. Bolton looked at him, looked at the 3 guards he'd just put on the ground. Looked at Longclaw, which was still pointing at him, with the steadiness of an arm that had not gotten tired. South, where the sounds of the battle were changing, less the continuous roar of an engagement, more the intermittent noise of a fight that was ending, the specific acoustic signature of resolution. "You understand," Bolton said, "that I planned this for years." "I know," Jon said. The phrase were, he stopped. Something moved across his face, the briefest thing there and gone. "It was a good plan. It worked," Jon said, "until it didn't." He kept the blade steady. "Surrender, Lord Bolton." A long moment, the horses breathed. The cold morning air sat between them. Roose Bolton removed his sword from its scabbard slowly, carefully, 2 fingers showing the gesture, and held it out hilt first toward Jon. Jon took it. "Dismount," Jon said. Bolton dismounted. His 7 guards, reading the room with the professionalism of men who knew a finished battle when they were standing inside one, did the same. Jon looked at the man standing in the road before him, the architect of the Red Wedding, the killer of his king, the person who had looked at Robb Stark across a dinner table and decided that a political advantage was worth more than 300 years of sacred law, and felt something that was not what he'd expected. He'd expected rage. He'd had rage earlier in the weeks of riding and fighting. What he felt now was colder and more settled than that, not peace, something more functional, the feeling of a thing done. "You'll face the Northern Lords," Jon said. "You'll answer for the Red Wedding, in an open assembly with witnesses." He paused. "That's what I offered. It still stands." Bolton looked at him. Something in the pale eyes shifted, not gratitude. Bolton didn't do gratitude, but something like acknowledgement. The recognition of a man who dealt in rules, even rules he bent, when another man showed he dealt in rules too. "Yes, my lord," Bolton said. The battle was over by mid-morning. Bolton's army, leaderless and flanked, had broken the way armies broke when the shape of a loss became clear, not all at once, but in a cascade, each company looking at the companies beside it and making the same calculation, and the calculation spreading outward like a crack in ice until the whole structure surrendered to it. Some men ran, most surrendered. A small contingent fought to the end with the commitment of men who had decided their odds were bad in either direction, and those engagements resolved the way they resolved. When Jon rode back onto the field, it was already past the violence. Stannis' men were organizing prisoners. Tormund's people were moving through the field with the specific practicality of folk who'd been living hard for too long to waste anything useful. The Northern Lords' banners were going up, Serwyn, Glover, Umber, Mormont, bright against the gray sky. Stannis met him near the center of the field. The king was unhurt, precise, his armor unmarked except for one dent in the left pauldron that suggested something had come close. He looked at Jon with those iron eyes and said, "Bolton." "Prisoner," Jon said, "surrendered on the North Road." Something moved in Stannis' jaw. He should hang. "He will answer for the Red Wedding first," Jon said, "before the Lords of the North in open assembly." "That's their right," he paused. "After the assembly decides, I won't interfere with whatever sentence comes out of it." Stannis looked at him steadily. The assessment was happening again, that grinding stone quality of a man testing everything for structural soundness. "You fight well," he said. "So do your men," Jon said. "They do," Stannis agreed without false modesty. He looked across the field. "We should discuss the arrangement. Tonight," Jon said, "at Winterfell." He looked at the sky, at the field, at the banners. "Let me have this afternoon." Stannis nodded once. He rode away without further ceremony, which was exactly what Jon appreciated about him. Sansa was waiting at the gates. She'd watched the battle from the walls, which was not what Jon had told her to do, but he found he didn't have the energy to address that. She was standing at the gate when he rode through, with Arya beside her, Arya who had also not listened to what Jon had told her to do, which was becoming a theme, and the two of them together was something Jon's chest did something complicated about, the two of them standing there after everything, alive, present, northern girls in northern winter air. Sansa was taller than he remembered, or he'd remembered her wrong, the way you remembered people you hadn't seen in years, the image refusing to update. She was composed and contained and had the expression of someone who had been keeping a great deal together for a long time and was now, in this specific moment, allowing herself to stop. He dismounted. She covered the distance between them and held him briefly with the specific careful dignity of someone who had learned to moderate every public action, and then apparently decided that was insufficient and held him properly. He held her back. Arya beside them said nothing, which was how he knew she found it moving. When Sansa stepped back, her eyes were bright, but her face was steady. "You look terrible," she said. "There was a battle," Jon said. "I watched from the wall." "You rode straight at him." "It worked," Jon said. "It was reckless," she said. She said it the way someone said something they've already accepted, an observation without the energy of protest. "We need to talk about Littlefinger." "Tonight," Jon said. "He's going to be a problem." "Everything is going to be a problem," Jon said. "I've decided that's the permanent state of having a castle. Tonight, Sansa." She looked at him and then, very slightly, smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it was brief, and it was everything. The assembly of Northern Lords happened 3 days later in what remained of Winterfell's great hall. Jon had the roof patched, not properly, but enough, and the hall lit with torches, and the lords sat at the long table and in the chairs brought from the surrounding rooms, and in some cases simply stood, because there were more of them than Winterfell's damaged hall had furniture for. They were all there, Serwyn and Glover, Small Jon Umber, Lyanna Mormont occupying her chair with the authority of someone 3 times her size, the Flint and Nori clan chief, Lord Manderly, who had arrived from White Harbor with 400 men and his enormous presence, and had occupied the chair to Jon's left with the settled authority of a man who had waited a long time for this and found it worth the wait, Meege Mormont's daughter, and several lesser lords from the upper north. Stannis sat at the far end of the table, separate from the Northern Lords, which was correct. He was a guest here and a claimant, and Jon had arranged it so the distinction was visible without being insulting. Roose Bolton stood at the center of the hall. He was not bound. Jon had thought about this, the image of a bound man, the theater of it, and decided against it. Bolton was a lord of the North, accused before his peers. He stood as a lord of the North, not as a prisoner, because this was justice, and justice required dignity to mean anything. Jon spoke first. He laid it out plainly, the Red Wedding, the letter from the unsigned Raven, Bolton's own Raven that had arrived with suspicious speed, the evidence as he understood it. He did not editorialize. He presented facts and let the lords do the work. Then he asked Bolton to speak. Bolton spoke. He was, as Jon had known he would be, articulate. He acknowledged presence at the twins. He constructed a careful narrative in which he had known something was wrong and had attempted to remove himself without being able to warn Robb in time. He was smooth and credible, and watching him do it, Jon understood for the first time fully why this man had managed to stay alive and powerful in a world that killed ambitious men regularly. He was very, very good at performing innocence. The lords were silent when he finished. Then Small Jon Umber stood up. Jon had not prepared Small Jon for this. He hadn't needed to. Small Jon stood up with the specific movement of a man who has been holding something for 3 weeks and has identified the correct moment to put it down, and he said in a voice that had nothing complicated in it, "I was at the twins. I saw men I'd fought beside for 2 years killed at a dinner table. I saw Lord Robb Stark." He stopped. The man who says he couldn't warn his king had time to get to his horse, had time to ride out before the gates closed. He sat down. The hall was very quiet. Lord Manderly, without standing, said, "The phrase acted. The Boltons knew. The North remembers." The last 3 words landed in the room like stones dropped in still water, and the lords around the table said nothing, but the silence was the most specific silence Jon had ever heard, the silence of people who had been waiting to say something and had just heard it said. Jon looked at Bolton. Bolton's face was still. The mask was still up even now, the pale eyes still recalculating, still looking for the mechanism, the angle, the door. There was no door. "The assembly has heard," Jon said. "The lords of the North will give their judgment." The judgment was not lengthy. It did not need to be. One by one, with the formality of people who understood that this moment had weight, the lords gave their verdict, and every one of them gave the same verdict, and at the end Roose Bolton was formally condemned by his peers for the violation of guest right and the murder of his king. Jon pronounced the sentence himself. He had thought about what Stannis had said, he should hang, and he'd thought about what was right and what was theater and what actually served the North. "The man who passes the sentence," Jon said, "should swing the sword." He looked at Bolton. Bolton looked at him. In the pale eyes something had finally changed. The mask had come down, not dramatically, not with any kind of visible collapse, just a very slight relaxing. The expression of a man who has arrived at the end of his road and found it exactly where he'd always known it would be. They went to the Godswood. Afterward, Jon stood at the edge of the black pool for a long time. He was alone, or as alone as he could be. Ghost was with him, lying beside the pool with his great head on his paws, watching the water. The weirwood's red eyes watched too. The heart tree had witnessed the Starks for 1,000 years and had watched this, and Jon stood in the silence of it in breath. He'd done what needed doing, he'd done it clean and without theater, and the North had witnessed it. That was all it needed to be. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time, the grief for Robb, for his mother, for his father, for all of it. He didn't try to hurry it. He'd learned that grief wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a fact to be carried, and you got better at carrying it over time, and the weight of it became something you were accustomed to, and eventually it became less like a burden and more like ballast, the thing that kept you from drifting into something lighter and less honest. He heard footsteps and turned. Sansa, which he knew by the sound, she walked precisely, each step deliberate. She came to stand beside him at the pool. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Littlefinger sent a raven," she said. "He says he wants to discuss terms." "Tomorrow," Jon said. "He's dangerous," she said. "I know," Jon said, "but he's the kind of dangerous that needs a ledge to stand on. I'm going to take the ledge away." He looked at the water. "He'll cooperate." "He wants to survive too much not to," Sansa nodded. She trusted him to handle it, which was not the same as not worrying, but it was something. "Arya's been teaching one of Tormund's men to fight with a knife," she said after a moment. "He's twice her size and she's apparently winning." "Yes," Jon said. "She would be." A pause. "Jon," Sansa said, "what happens now?" He'd been thinking about this. About Stannis and the kingship question and the long night that Sam kept saying was coming and the reconstruction of Winterfell and the free folk land grants and a dozen other things that existed in the space beyond tonight's single settled matter. "The North needs to be whole," he said. "The wall needs the North behind it. Sam's right about that. Whatever's coming from the North is coming, and it's not a political problem." He paused. "Stannis needs the North to have any real claim to the throne. We need Stannis' military power, and we need him to deal with King's Landing so the North can face north." He looked at the pool. "It's not simple." "Nothing is," Sansa said. "No," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "You could be king," she said, carefully, feeling the edge of it. "I know," he said. "Do you want to be?" He thought about it. The honest answer was that he didn't want it the way some men wanted it, the power, the title, the declaration. He'd never wanted the title. What he wanted was for the North to be safe and whole, and for the people in it to stop dying of other people's ambitions, and if being king was what it took to do that, then he would be king, and if it wasn't he wouldn't, and either way he wasn't going to pretend about it. "I want the North to be all right," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes for that." Sansa looked at him. "That's either the most kingly thing you could say or the least." "Probably both," he said. She almost smiled. 2 almost smiles in 3 days, he was counting. The thing happened the next night, after a dinner that was remarkable mainly for including food, real food, Lou having turned out to be genuinely gifted in ways that went beyond the adequate, and Stannis sitting at Jon's right and being terse and courteous, and doing that thing where he managed to be both at once, and Tormund eating everything in reach with the enthusiasm of a man who'd spent his life wondering what variety tasted like. The lords had been drinking. The evening had the particular quality of a celebration that also contained grief, people who had been afraid for a long time and were now something else but didn't quite know what to call it yet, finding each other across the table and the talking becoming louder and the torches making everything golden in the patched hall. Lyanna Mormont stood up. She did it without warning, without being called upon, without any of the procedural formality that would usually preface a formal address. She simply stood up on her chair because she was 10 years old and the chair was the only way the table could see her, and the room went quiet the way rooms went quiet for her, with the quality of people who hadn't entirely decided to respect her and found they did anyway. "I'm not going to make a speech," she said, her voice carried without being loud. "The Mormonts of Bear Island have always known what we believed. We pledged to House Stark and we meant it." She looked down the table at Jon. "Jon Stark took back Winterfell. Jon Stark called the banners. Jon Stark met Roose Bolton in the field and won. Jon Stark passed sentence and swung the sword." She paused. "The North doesn't need to think about this." She looked around the table. "The king in the North," she said. "His name is Stark." Lord Manderley was on his feet before she finished, and he was not a man who moved quickly. "The king in the North," he said, and his voice was the voice of a large man, which was a large voice. Small John Umber stood. "The king in the North, Serwyn, Glover, the Flint Chief, the Nari." One by one and then simultaneously, lords of the North rising to their feet around the long table in the torchlight, raising their cups and their voices in a declaration that had been waiting to be made, that had been building since the night Jon rode away from the wall with 5 friends and a direwolf and a letter from a dead king. "The king in the North, the king in the North, the king in the North." Jon sat in Ned Stark's chair, in his father's chair, and heard his name called out across the hall and did not look away from it. He felt it land. He let it be real. He didn't perform humility or theater the way some men performed those things, the practiced reluctance of someone who'd been planning for this moment and wanted it to look unplanned. He'd never planned for this. He'd planned for the North to be safe, one step at a time, and this was where those steps had led. He looked at Sansa, who was watching him with something in her face that was composed and fierce and proud and completely her own. He looked at Arya, who was grinning with the unself-conscious absolute joy of someone who had not yet decided to be complicated about anything, both arms up, shouting louder than people twice her size. He looked at Sam, who was crying, which Sam did sometimes when things were important, and who was also writing in his book because Sam was always going to be Sam. He looked at Tormund, who had a cup in one hand and his axe in the other, raised to the ceiling, bellowing in the old tongue. He looked at Grenn, who was red-faced and grinning and hitting Ed on the arm repeatedly, and Ed, who was trying to look unmoved and failing completely. He looked at Stannis at the far end of the table, who had not risen and had not shouted, who was watching Jon with those iron eyes doing the work of a man, adjusting to a new fact in the world. They would have their conversation tomorrow. It would be complicated. Jon was not afraid of complicated. Jon stood. The hall got louder when he stood, which was interesting. He raised a hand, not for silence, just for attention, the difference being important, and the noise reduced itself to something he could speak over. "I am Jon Stark," he said. "My father was Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, Hand of the King. My brother was Robb Stark, King in the North." He paused. "They were both better men than I am. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve what they left me and failing, which is how it should be. The memory of men better than you is supposed to be something you can never quite reach." He looked around the hall. The North is not safe. There are things coming that are not Boltons, that are not Lannisters, that are not anything we have words for yet, and when they come we will need to be whole and ready and together. He stopped. Everything else can wait. The North cannot. The hall was very still. Then Tormund shouted something in the old tongue and the noise came back, and Ghost threw his head back in the middle of the hall and the sound that came out of him moved through the stone walls and across the yard and out over the winter dark. A white wolf's voice in a ruined castle in the snow, and it was the right sound for the moment, Jon thought. It was exactly the right sound, not triumphant, not fearful, just present, just alive, here, still standing. Jon sat back down in his father's chair in Winterfell's torchlit hall, with his sisters and his friends and the lords of the North around him, and outside the snow was falling and the wall was north, and everything that needed to be done next was waiting patiently in the dark for morning. He could wait too. He'd earned one night.